All right, we're going to get started. So for those of you who are not attending yesterday or were, just a reminder, I'm LaDawn Kaler with Idaho DEQ. And this is day 2 of our multi-agency funding training for water and wastewater projects. At the end of each topic, there'll be questions. Add your questions virtually or write them down if you're in person, and we'll address them at the end or in between, as some speakers like to do. I think that's it for that. And our agenda, we're going to cover engineering work first thing this morning. It's going to be a little different than yesterday. We have 3 engineers here in person and 1 who is virtual, Nicholas, and he's already up on the screen for those of you in person. I pinned him for everybody virtually, and then we'll have a little bit of a break, and then we'll cover environmental work, finishing out grant loan, and then project examples. And it'll probably take a little less time than yesterday. Who knows? I'll get long-winded, so be prepared. All right. Any questions before I get started? Issues? Okay. Just so that you know, we kind of reformatted this from the 2020 training in that we aren't going to go through step by step every single thing like we have done in the past. If you would like that option and you would like to see that, the old trainings are still up on our YouTube channel. They can be found there. Interagency training day 1, day 2 from 2020 are posted. We're really focusing on updates and things we get a lot of questions on today when it comes to the engineering work and the environmental work. And that is it for me, and I will turn it over to Kevin.
Perfect. Well, thank you all again for joining us for our second day of presentations. Really appreciate it, and thank you, LaDawn, and then also a thank you to IRWA for hosting a great location. Really appreciate that as well. Just to start us off with the engineering, we're going to have Kent Erickson, who's my colleague, myself, Dennis Porter, and Nicholas, who is going to be online. These are going to be the presenters for this first half on engineering, and then we'll have another half regarding environmental as well. Basically, here's what we're going to talk about: navigating the engineering review process. We're going to have some discussion on project delivery methods, and then Build America, Buy America. That is kind of all coming down. Many of you probably have already heard about it. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about it today, but there's definitely going to be some future presentations by various agencies on it down the road as well that will even be in more detail than what we'll cover today. We're going to talk about getting from bid opening to notice to proceed, and then we're going to talk about surviving construction and the closeout of the project. One of the more important things, I think, from the R&D perspective that I want to discuss on this slide is one, with our area specialist. Noel yesterday had talked about our area specialists being the primary contact, and they're the boots on the ground. You can think of Kent and I as like the hired guns who go in there, and we work with the area specialists to review the technical aspects of the project. But the area specialists are really critical with regard to RD to making sure that project happens and it gets obligated. So as engineers or as cities or as operators, you want to make sure that your engineer and yourselves are contacting the area specialists in addition to Kent or I as far as rural development is concerned. Especially like with facility plans, you might think, oh, I'll just send this to Kent or I'll send this to Kevin. But you want to make sure that area specialist is also contacted and at the very least CC'd on that email, because they're tracking where this project is going and making sure things are happening. So that I wanted to bring up as one of the most important aspects, is to keep that area specialist in mind when working through this project. The other aspect of this is basically going to our website. This website here, you can see it on there and go to the website. It basically has all of our documents that are really needed for the engineering and technical aspects of it. So your facility plan kind of guides, your contract documents between the owner and engineer, and your contract documents for going out to bid. We have all our attachments there. Those are all necessary for our projects, and they're all right there. We're going to be updating those with additional resources that we'll be talking about in this presentation later as well. And so next to talk about their website is Dennis.
So mentioned it yesterday too, is on King for Commerce, the Community Development Block Grant Program, is we're trying to update, keep our website fresh. So if you go onto our website, we do have our application handbook that's available. So those of you applying for CDBG funds, it's up there. We also have our grant, more importantly, our grant administration manual. The manual will take you through how some of the topics we're going to cover today, fundamentals, steps to go through that. The Davis-Bacon, our federal labor standards, we have a chapter dedicated to that. We have a chapter dedicated to procurement, the expectations under commerce, how you would procure, go out to bid, or possibly if you're looking to do maybe, design, build type procurement. Procuring your engineers too. That's another component we have in our procurement chapter. And then also in there is our land acquisition. You got to follow the Uniform Act. What are the steps required there? Then we have some of our contract documents are available there as well. So if you're looking, we've broken out, somebody brought up the question about EJCDC documents. We don't have those up on our website, but we also have some of our attachments that would go onto the engineering agreement. And then if they're smaller projects, we also have some what we call small construction documents. So please look at our website. We try to keep it fresh and available. So go on there and find those documents. And then if you get into some other deeper dive questions, if you're looking at heavy or highway on Davis-Bacon, we have that memorandum which breaks out and should hopefully clarify is this project heavy or is it a highway when you start looking at Davis-Bacon classifications. And always too, if that doesn't work, you can give us a call. So we're available to help you, Danny or Tony or me.
I think, Nicholas, you're next to talk about the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality website.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you virtually. I'm assuming that I'm coming through loud and clear, so let me know if I'm not, and I can slow down or speed up accordingly. As Kevin alluded to, my name's Nicholas. I work with DEQ. I'm a senior water quality engineer and primarily work with Mariana's group, the Grant and Loan Bureau, to help on the implementation side of these projects. And so prior to this, I spent almost 10 years in the Lewiston Regional Office, and I currently still work remote out of the Lewiston Regional Office. And as we move through these projects and move through this engineering topics, similar to like RD, we have regional engineers. Many of you probably know them on a first name basis in our 6 regions, and they're really the ones that implement these projects. They're the ones that do the heavy lifting for us. And so as you move into engineering, you're going to be getting to know these regional office engineers very well. They're going to be your primary point of contact as you move into the actual construction of these projects. And so kind of as a backdrop to that, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is going to be the engineering process today, and you're going to be working with those regional engineers to implement these projects. So wanted to also kind of direct everyone to our website. So if you go to www.deq.idaho.gov, you're going to see the tabs along the top here. If you click on water, there's going to be a drop-down box, and the second red arrow there is construction loans. And you can also go to our website and put a /SRF on it, and it'll take you to this page. And this is really the money spot. This is where you want to go to for all things SRF. So next slide, please. So if you click on that, the best place to go is to scroll down to the bottom under this resources tab. And under the resources tab, this is where you're going to find really kind of your go-to information. This includes letters of interest, intended use plans, anything that's kind of fresh off the press, so to speak. Hot topics are going to be listed in this resource tab. And so again, you're always welcome to call us and with questions. And a lot of times we're going to direct you to our website, specifically our customer handbook. That's at the top of the list of resources. And Mariana mentioned it briefly. So if you click on that resources and click on customer handbook. It's going to pull up our customer handbook. We'll go to the next slide, please. And this is going to be your go-to for all things DEQ SRF. It goes into detail, but not too much detail. It's a pretty easy read. It's about 30 pages. And today, we're really going to be focusing on section 3 of the customer handbook. Mariana yesterday, really did a great job of walking through the first 2 sections there. Today, we're going to be focusing on the project implementation, which really is the engineering. The engineering is what drives these projects from start to finish. So that's where, if you missed something today or if you need clarification, again, you're welcome to reach out to us. But I'd really encourage everybody. We're going to be referencing this handbook on the DEQ resources as we go through, because everything lives there. That's where not only the narrative descriptions are, but that's where you're going to find all the resources to actually make this happen. So just kind of want to give a quick plug for the customer handbook. And we're always looking for improvements. Is there something that is not answered in that customer handbook that you think you should be? Let us know. Well, this customer handbook is routinely updated to stay up to date with all the new federal requirements that are kind of hitting us in the face right now. So we are trying to keep this up to date, real time, the best information. So great resource. We'll move on to the next slide as we move kind of more into the DEQ engineering process. Mariana mentioned yesterday that DEQ really has, when we talk about the engineering process, we really kind of have 2 interrelated functions. The first one is DEQ review of plans and specs, which is required by Idaho Code 39118 for wastewater and drinking water systems. And so whether you've got DEQ funding or not, you're going to be going through the regional offices to get review and approval of your facility plan, your preliminary engineering report, and your plans and specs. That's just the bare minimum. Now, if you add DEQ funding to the mix, we'll add another layer of DEQ involvement where we're also going to be reviewing the bid documents. We're going to also be involved in the construction contract, construction management activities, and then making sure that we can close out the project from a record drawing or an engineering standpoint, and also from a final SRF inspection standpoint. So again, that's the process. Just walking through this really quick. The facility plan, again, this is going to be for all projects. That's really your 20-year to 40-year planning document. That's your roadmap. That's going to assess the entire system and typically it's going to bring forward capital improvement plan. It's going to bring forward selected alternatives to be able to implement, which will ultimately end up in implementing a project. The next step would be the preliminary engineering report. And there's some similarities between the facility plan and the preliminary engineering report. But that preliminary engineering report is really the basis of design for that project, for the selected alternative. So your facility plan might have a dozen, hopefully not. It might have a couple projects that it wants to bring forward, but you might only be doing the first project. And so that preliminary engineering report is going to bring that first project forward. It's going to develop the basis of design, the design criteria, conceptual designs. It's going to really set you up to move you into the next phase. And just kind of pausing there, sometimes, it's possible because there is overlap occasionally between the facility plan and this preliminary engineering report. Sometimes you can try to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and get your facility plan and your preliminary engineering report kind of bundled together and approved at the same time. If you're like me, in most projects, if you're trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, you typically end up missing both of them. So it really kind of has to be the perfect situation to be able to do that with a simple project, a straightforward project, and a single project alternative in the facility plan. And also, your regional engineer has to be comfortable with this. And so take home, go talk to your regional engineer if you want to try to bundle these together. Best practice, keep them separate and satisfy them as kind of they're intended to be separate documents. The next step, you hear plans and specs. That's the big one. That's the actual construction plans and specs. Bid documents, obviously, most of these projects are going to require public procurement requirements be followed. And so formal bid documents that satisfy Idaho code and competitive bidding are going to need to be reviewed by DEQ. Once DEQ reviews those from the SRF side of things, we're going to issue an authorization to award contract. And we're going to get into this a little bit more detail. And then from there, construction starts. DEQ is going to be involved in construction management, whether that's inspections, change orders, monthly progress meetings. And then finally, when you get to the end, you're going to need record drawings on all projects. Most projects are going to require an O&M manual. Most projects are going to require green project reserve and a final engineering inspection. And we're going to dive into these details a little bit more, and we're going to kind of popcorn back and forth between DEQ, RD, block grant, and try to walk through the whole process. And so there's going to be some back and forth. There's overlap between DEQ and RD and block grant, but this is kind of, in general, this is kind of the steps that you'll want to think about as you move into engineering. All right, next slide. We are going to take a little bit of a detour here, and we're going to talk about project delivery method and explore that a little bit. What most of us are familiar with, and I would say DEQ and RD and block grant, our funding process and our engineering process is built around the traditional project delivery method. And so that's design, bid, build, where you hire a professional engineer. He designs the project. You go out to competitive bidding. You select the lowest bidder, and then that lowest bidder goes and builds the project, and you have your engineer who's managing and inspecting construction through the whole process. And so, again, this process is what our existing system is built around. It's tried and true. It works. There's some potential weaknesses to it, but it works. And so typically when we're approaching funding a project, this is what we anticipate. This is what we're assuming is going to happen. And it's really, why reinvent the wheel when you don't have to? And there's some real strengths to this process. However, there are alternative project delivery methods that we're starting to see becoming more popular, or at least people more interested in it. And we'll go to the next slide, please, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So essentially with alternative delivery, we're talking about some form of typically design build is kind of the most common, or some form of general manager, general contractor. Sometimes it's referred to as construction manager at risk. So with design build, we have seen a couple of projects go through the SRF process with progressive design build, and it's a little bit different than maybe a traditional design build. It's got kind of some more collaborative steps in it that can be really beneficial. And so kind of again, we're not going to go into detail with these, but kind of the big picture overview is, the owner is going to go out for a request for proposal for a design concept and a project budget. And so you're going to get a pool of firms that develop a conceptual design and a project budget for you. And that's the competitive process, is they're bringing forward a project concept, design concept, and budget. Once you've got that, typically 30% design concept worked through, the owner is then going to select a single firm to complete the design and construction under one contract. And that design concept is going to be moved to final design, or a 70 to 90% design. And at that point, you would then negotiate a guaranteed max price. And there's a lot of other complexities to this, but again, it's this interactive process that moves you through the design build process in more of a collaborative approach. Instead of just saying go build it, you're collaborating with this contractor and engineer to design the project through the process. So typically we've seen that the owner is going to hire an owner's representative to kind of help manage that contract, to manage the contracting mechanism. And it is governed by several sections of Idaho code to allow this. So again, it's kind of a new process. We've been able to successfully fund 2 progressive design build projects in the last couple of years, and they've worked out really well. Again, one size doesn't fit all. Another delivery method is this GMGC delivery method, and this is kind of like a hybrid between the traditional delivery method and the progressive design build method. So in this scenario, the owner is going to hire two separate entities, so that you're going to hire the engineer and a general manager, which is basically a general contractor, and you're going to hire them basically at the same time. And so you've got on your team now, you've got two independent firms. You've got a consultant who's doing the design, and then you've got a general contractor, general manager, who is helping develop that design. And so at that point, this general manager is going to be doing constructability analysis. They're going to do bid takeoffs as the design progresses. And so you have this kind of, again, this collaborative approach where you've got a contracting firm and an engineering firm that are working on the design together. Once you get to final design, this GMGC contractor typically can then go find subcontractors to do the work or bid some of the work himself. And this GMGC is going to manage the construction. He's going to take this design and manage the construction all the way to the end. Or there is typically, it depends how it's set up, there's typically a off ramp if, let's say, you're just not jiving with this contractor. You can take that 100% design and just go out and bid it out. So the off ramp would be you just go back to that essentially traditional delivery method where you competitively bid this project that you've now developed. Again, pros and cons to each one of these. And the big takeaway is make sure to consult with your funding agency early. Not all funding agencies, not all projects are set up to be able to accommodate this. And so it's really important that if you're considering wanting to do an alternative project delivery, that with SRF funding or any of the other funding partners here, really, really early in the process, like when you're starting to think about this is when you should probably start talking to DEQ and the other funding agencies. So Kevin or Kent or Dennis, anything to add to this?
Yeah, I would just echo what Nicholas says as far as talking to the funding agencies. I know with rural development, typically you do the design, bid, build scenario, but in the past we've looked at it, and if you are considering going down that path, you definitely need to come to RD because we don't have that as an approved method yet through our national office. So in order to get to there, we need to start that process early. Luckily, most of the projects we do are smaller projects, which are very suitable for design, bid, build. But if you have a larger project that you're wanting to do that, definitely get with us early so we can get that type of contract in place and approved through our national office.
This is Kent. I would only add one thing there is that our national office is considering putting documents together for progressive design build and design build. And CMGC, we call it CMGC, Construction Manager General. But right now they don't have those documents put together yet. So if an applicant wanted to use that method, we really don't have that capability right now very well. We would have to actually get the contract documents approved by our OGC, which could take months. It's not a fun process. So, but hopefully we can get there. On certain projects, it would make sense. Most of our projects that we fund, typically, they're small enough so we don't usually have an opportunity where it would make that much sense to do this way. But there are some projects that really could benefit from this. But we'll update that as time goes on.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what's already been mentioned. If you decide or thinking about going either one of those two methods, just contact us early so that we're aware and we can work with you in the structure and work for CDBG program.
Thanks, Nicholas. I think it's back to you again.
Yeah, perfect. So next slide. So kind of on that topic, like when might you consider alternative project delivery? And some of the common themes that have shown themselves true for this alternative delivery concept are laid out here. The first one being, I think both Kent and Kevin mentioned it, is just project size. So the upfront effort, there's a large amount of upfront effort when you're doing alternative delivery. And so it really makes most sense. If you're going to spend that upfront effort, you need to have some payback on the back end of construction, and it really only makes sense when it's a larger project. And so, what is a large project? I don't know. I mean, we can all kind of discuss. You can discuss that with your staff and internally of when does it make sense. And that's sometimes, if you can reach out to firms or other systems that have experience with alternative delivery, you can start to get a feel for yourself of when it might make sense for you. Along the same lines, complexity is another big one. If it's a technically complex project, it can benefit from additional collaboration from a contractor or a general manager. So, typically we're looking at like treatment plant rebuilds or, more complex treatment type projects. And we're typically not talking about like a pipe project, new pipe in the ground type project. Same thing with constructability. A lot of the value that you get out of the alternative delivery process is you've got a contractor really involved from day one who can tell you, no, we wouldn't do it that way, or we should do it this way, or we could save money doing it this way. And so when you've got, large like retrofit projects where you're going into existing infrastructure and completely overhauling it, it begins to make a little bit more sense. Like, man, it would really be helpful to have like a contractor, either on board or kind of leading the charge, figuring out some of these questions of constructability of how are we going to actually do this. Schedule can be a big driver. Like, quite frankly, this is probably one of the biggest drivers. Like if you need to fast track a project, getting the contractor on board early or even under contract early, it starts to contract days for them, and they're moving, they're driving the schedule. And time for contractors, time is money. And so they are highly motivated to get the project moved through design and into construction as fast as they can. And so, if you've got, a treatment plant or something that, it's got imminent failure on the horizon, where you're like, we've got to get this fixed soon, or the risks of failure of existing infrastructure are disastrous. That starts to kind of lean towards like, well, maybe alternative delivery might help. The last one, just general capacity. This is one that I think is often overlooked when people are considering alternative delivery, and that is, does the owner, as the owner, do you have capacity to be more involved in this project? There's going to be on-spot decisions that are going to have to be made. You're going to have to be very involved up front and through the process to be able to drive some of these decisions. And along with that, DEQ is a major player in that capacity question, both from the funding standpoint and from the engineering standpoint. This alternative delivery really works well when you've got a team that's fully integrated, from regulators to contractors to engineers to owners, that can make quick decisions and has the capacity to turn around quick reviews. And so that's where you really start to save some of the effort and gain some of the benefit, is when you can make those quick decisions, quick turnarounds, and kind of plays into that scheduling component of alternative delivery. So those are kind of some things to think about with alternative delivery. Again, one size does not fit all, but if you're considering alternative delivery, some things to think about, and we're happy to brainstorm, as you're moving into a project and thinking about funding a project. Let us know if you're brainstorming this, and we'd be happy to sit down, get the people that we need to involved, and chat through it. So with that, Kevin or Kent or Dennis, do you have anything to add to that, or we'll move on?
We're good.
All right, moving on.
Yes, appreciate it. So our next slide here is on the RD engineering flow chart. When I just started off at RD, I got this flow chart, and it was really my roadmap to what I needed to do technically, and what I needed to ask of the engineers that we're working with to receive. So for me, this was a very good blessing to have this in front of me, know what I needed to do and how I needed to do things. and for you engineers and even the city to understand kind of what the process is for RD. It goes from the very beginning, prior to obligation over funds, all the way through closeout, and what you as engineers will technically need to do. This, as I mentioned earlier, is on our website. You can download it. If you're ever having a hard time getting a hold of it, feel free to contact Kent or I, or our area specialist, or Noel. Any of us can get this spread or flow chart to you. And I'm not going to go into any great detail on it here, but basically it goes from, you know, your facility plan and your environmental, which is absolutely needed before obligation, all the way through construction and the project manuals and some of the things we need to do and some of the things that are very intricate to RD, and it'll lead you through that step by step. And so definitely download that, get that, and follow that. If you have any questions on the details of that, talk to Kent or I or any of the area specialists. So that's what I have for that. The next slide actually goes into another thing that was our DEQs, but we partnered with DEQ along with Idaho Department or Community Block Grants, Community Block Grants and the Army Corps to come up with a checklist that Nicholas will go into some detail on.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. So again, we're going to plug the customer handbook here, the DEQ customer handbook. On the left here of the screen, you can see all the different resources and attachments that you're going to need to know where they are to get through a project. And the first one that is, I think, a great resource and really crucial, especially when it comes to multiple funding agencies, is this facility plan or this planning document checklist. And so this checklist is going to walk you through an outline and very detailed information of what needs to be in a planning document and the process to go through that. It used to be, I'll say the old days, but it really wasn't that long ago. RD and Block Grant and DEQ, we developed kind of an interagency outline for developing a facility plan. And it worked, but as we looked at it, it wasn't really being utilized. And it didn't really make sense to have multiple checklists for essentially the same thing that we're trying to accomplish here. And so earlier this year, Kevin and Kent and Dennis and myself, we got together and we said, okay, what are the differences in our facility plan requirements? And how can we incorporate that into just a single checklist? And so that's what we did. We've essentially developed a checklist that meets all of DEQ requirements from a technical standpoint, and then all of the funding requirements from the different agencies. So this is a great resource, and one of the things you'll see that's different is just right off the bat, we're going to ask you, who's funding this project, who's funding this facility plan, who's going to fund this project, and that's going to kind of give you an idea of like, oh, it's RD and Block Grant, or it's DEQ and Army Corps, and that's going to give not only you but the reviewer kind of a feel for what requirements are going to kick in. And it's kind of a spoiler alert. I mean, basically, we have almost identical requirements across the board. I mean, a facility plan is industry standard. It's not rocket science, right? What needs to go into it. And so this was really a pretty easy lift for us, but it kind of finishes tying the knot, so to speak, instead of leaving it kind of loose, the shoelace a little bit loose. And so that's the first thing you'll see. And then you'll also see, I'll let Kevin talk about it a little bit more. You'll see some areas in the checklist where we kind of put some asterisks of like, well, this is only a DEQ requirement, or this is only an RD requirement. So it kind of helps you kind of flow through. If you're doing an RD project, pay close attention to those little asterisks because you absolutely need those. If you're doing just a DEQ funded project, good to have information, but not absolutely necessary is kind of what we're looking at. So Kevin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to build on that, and actually just for you guys as you're looking at this checklist, making sure you have that correct checklist. I just actually talked to an engineer. I was like, hey, do you have the latest checklist? Like, oh yeah, I have the latest checklist. I was like, okay, well at the top doesn't have the check boxes for community block grants, for DEQ, for RD. He's like, no, it does not. I was like, oh, okay, let me send you the latest checklist. So if you want to make sure you have that latest checklist, look at the top, make sure it has those check boxes for the different agencies. If it doesn't, you have an older checklist. So make sure you have the latest and greatest, which will be on DEQ's website, and we'll also have it on our website as well. And as Nicholas was saying, there's the asterisks. which you'll see there in that lower example, which is basically our RD requirements. And a lot of those asterisks really have to do with the obligation of the funds. I know there's a lot about EDUs and costs and O&M. A lot of those details are needed by our area specialist to get that funding to your client, to make sure that they have the best loan to grant ratio. Those details really matter for working through that obligation. If you ever have any questions on exactly what we're looking for, definitely talk to Kent or myself, the area specialist. No, we all know what's needed there, and we can provide you those details. So definitely look out for those start items. If there's even an inkling that you're thinking you're going to have to potentially get dual funding, you might want to just throw it in there. It's probably not going to be, it's not going to hurt. I think Nicholas will probably say it doesn't hurt to have that in there. But if you don't have that in there, and then you try to get funding from us, it makes it a little bit more challenging down the road to get that and to retroactively pull that information. So it's easier to have it in there up front. But if you don't, if you really know you're just going to go for like community block grants or DEQ funding, you don't have to put our stuff in there. But if you think you're going to get to that point where you're going to have dual funding, I would say throw it in there, because there's been many times where I'll look through a facility plan that we receive that's been approved by like DEQ or community block grants a year ago. Then we look at it and we're like, oh, okay, we're going to need to ask for these X amount of things. So my suggestion is throw it in there if you're even thinking about getting dual funding. Yes.
Is this the residential equivalent dwelling units? That's not used to back calculate the 10,000 people that.
No, it is not. That is used for basically looking at the user rates, making sure they look at like the median household income, the user rates. They pull that information together to make sure that the money that's being obligated in the grant to loan ratio is adequate for the community. So it's really critical for that. Yeah.
On your flow chart, pretty early on, we have to submit an application, which means we have to get grant funding, or we have to be able to incur debt. So that's, in our case, that's going to be a long ways past when we've done most of our engineering in our facility planning. Is there a way to expedite that or get you
The application.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, basically you can start working with the area specialists, and that's typically who you work with to get that application. They know that system really well, and they'll work with basically the engineer and the city to input that information into there. If there's any question ever, that area specialist within that area will get you that information and help expedite that.
So we can get that submitted and reviewed before we actually submit an application.
Is that correct?
Get your application submitted and reviewed?
No, get the facility plan and the engineering document.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
That's a question. Yes, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, for sure. For sure, you can do that. So then one of the other aspects about this checklist that the checklist doesn't have, but you may want to come to the area specialist, Kent or I, about, is we do have a spreadsheet, and we as engineers always love spreadsheets and numbers. We always love putting stuff into spreadsheets and doing the calculations. We put one together that covers a lot of the aspects of those requirements in the facility plan that we want to see, such as EDUs, commercial EDUs, the O&M costs and whatnot. And that spreadsheet, if you come to us early, you can basically copy and paste those charts and put them right into your facility plan. And that's exactly the information that the area specialists are looking for in the format they're looking for, and also the format that goes into our RD apply, where you're applying for that. So definitely ask for that spreadsheet. We can always modify it if you see issues with it, but that spreadsheet really gets us there, and you can basically copy and paste your numbers that you put into there into your facility plan, which makes it really easy for people our area specialists to look at that. Yes.
You just had residential and community or commercial EDUs. I thought you said yesterday that you wanted to have them converted so that
Yes, it is the commercial EDUs basically converted into residential EDUs. Yes. Yep. And so the next part, Nicholas will talk about the DEQ project manual.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin. So kind of diving in now to the details of how do you get your engineering project approved. So you've gone through the facility plan, you've secured the funding, you've got an engineer working on the design, and you're ready to move into construction. And so this is where we're kind of diving into. So the first is with DEQ and I believe RD and block grant and Army Corps, you're going to need approval of those plans and specs and those bidding documents prior to going out to bid. And so again, this is that kind of extra layer of a normal DEQ review plus the bidding documents to go out to bid. And so you will get a review and an approval from DEQ on that. Those plans and specs, they have to satisfy the design standards of the drinking water and wastewater rules. We've already kind of talked about that. And then they also need to include, the bidding documents need to include the SRF supplemental specifications and the Davis-Bacon wage rate. So again, on the left side of the screen here, where do you get the SRF supplemental specifications? Customer handbook. They are also, kind of to make a plug, they're also included in the funding agreement. So if sometimes we run into the problem of maybe you get your funding agreement and it takes you 2 or 3 years to develop to get to bidding. These supplemental spec inserts represent the most up-to-date current spec insert requirements for today. And so if your funding agreement is 2 or 3 years old, hopefully it's not. Hopefully you're moving into design and construction quicker than that. But if it is, you'll want to use that supplemental spec insert that was included in your loan offer, your grant offer. That's important because, again, there's new requirements coming out, and if you don't use the right spec insert, you might be doing more than you need to when it comes to the requirements for the construction contract. So take home, know your funding agreement, work with your regional engineer to make sure that that spec insert is the correct one, because the most up-to-date spec inserts are included in the handbook as of today. Also, kind of along the same lines, I know we've talked about engineering contracts and EJCDC and whatnot. Our rules do require that SRF funded projects use Idaho State Public Works Construction contracts, ISPWC, and the ISPWC uses an amended version of the EJCDC. There is a little clause in our rules that says or otherwise approved by DEQ, and so that pretty much kicks the door wide open. And so basically we're going to be looking, the regional engineers are going to be looking to make sure that you're using a standard construction contract. And if it's not, we might have some questions and we might have to work towards something that's more standardized. Typically that doesn't come up very often. I mean, if your consultant if you're familiar with competitive bidding, you're going to be using standardized bidding documents and construction contracts. So it doesn't come up a lot, but that is something to kind of be aware of a little bit. Next slide. This kind of brings up another topic of when you go to get your plan and spec approval. It's really important that not only you know your funding agency, but you know your funding sources. And so this has come up with DEQ quite a bit as of recent, because the last couple of years, many of you might know, and Mariana alluded to this yesterday, we received quite a lot of American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA funding, and some general funds, which are Leading Idaho funding. And both of those funding sources came with very different requirements. And so you need to understand what funding sources you have, or the combination of funding sources, to be able to know what the requirements are for the construction contract and the bidding documents. And you need to know if you have a mix of those funding sources, because certain funding sources basically act as an umbrella and kick in requirements for the whole project. And so this is a little visual that we put together last year that just kind of walks you through some of the major, we call it red tape. I think everybody calls it red tape that comes with funding, federal funding. It gives you a little visual of if you're only using Leading Idaho funding, that's probably the cleanest funding you can get. And none of those federal requirements are going to kick in. But if you're using any kind of combination with SRF funding, pretty much those federal requirements are going to kick in. So a little visual to kind of help you understand. But again, the takeaway: know your funding source and know your funding agency, because again, if you've got multiple funding agencies, you're going to have to include the spec inserts and the forms for both agencies. And so again, it's the paperwork that comes with getting a good deal on funding a project. So we'll go on to the next slide. So this slide really highlights again those regional offices. They're the ones that are reviewing these project submittals. They're the ones that are boots on the ground doing inspections. You'll be working directly with them in the regional offices. And so to submit a project, if you've never done this before, typically your engineer is going to go onto our website. Well, the way we would recommend is electronically. You can still do the old paper copy method if that floats your boat. It's going to take longer. It's going to be more work for everyone. We've really streamlined our process for submittal electronically, and it really helps speed up the process. So if you go to our website, you're going to go under the public information tab. Under the public information tab is going to be a sub-tab for engineering and development. And so if you click on that engineering and development tab and scroll down to the bottom of the page, just like we did for the grants and loans, you're going to see this box that says submit your engineering project for review. And you're going to have the 6 different regional offices across the tab. We've got Boise, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho Falls, Lewiston, Pocatello, and Twin Falls. And so if you click on the region that you're in, if you don't know what region you're in, it's pretty simple to figure that out online as well. You'll follow the directions there to upload your project, to fill out the necessary information and upload your project to that regional office. And typically you'll get an email back within a couple days from that regional office, that says, hey, we got your project, it's logged in, and this is the engineer that's going to be reviewing the project. And so again, this is intended to streamline the process and keep things kind of moving quickly. So pretty simple stuff, but just wanted to make sure that's how you get your project in for DEQ review, whether it's just an engineering project with no DEQ funding or an engineering project with DEQ funding. It's going to be the same process. So with that, we'll move on to Kent, I believe, or Ryan, Kevin.
Mic on so you can hear. Okay. Thanks, Kevin. I'm Kent Erickson. I'm a state engineer for Idaho State Office, and with RD almost 18 years actually. So we're going to talk about real quick open and free competition. But before that, I wanted to kind of go back a few slides on the facility plan. There's some important things that I realized we didn't really put in slides, but probably should have mentioned. One being the principal RD differences in the facility plan, the things that we require. Short-lived assets being one of them. That's one that, for equipment that lasts less than 15 years, 5, 10, 15 years, things that need to be replaced during the life of the project. Those need to be in there. And basically, O&M is real important too, both projected and existing O&M costs. And of course, like Kevin mentioned, the EDU counts is critical. EDUs, it's interesting to hear the conversation about commercial EDUs versus residential. Well, an EDU is an EDU. It's based on residential flow. So the commercial usage is converted into residential EDUs. And we require a life cycle cost analysis for all of our facility plans. So to get the best, use of our money. Another, it's too loud. I'm accused of being too loud. So open and free competition is a major thing with rural development. It's one of the primary things that we look at in the facility planning process and the plans and specs. So we have to be careful to make sure that in the project there's no statements that say only a certain product can be provided with no or equal considered. Or equals are in the contract documents. There are paragraphs that talk about them in the general conditions. They can be submitted in both before bids are received and after the contract is awarded. So anytime there are instances where an engineer might say, well, we need to have a certain type of meter because they have existing equipment that they want to manage. In those instances, we can entertain those requests for a sole source of a certain type of equipment. It usually doesn't need to happen. So if you ever have a situation where you need to do a sole source justification, just contact Ken or sorry, Kevin or me, and just explain that situation to us. So that kind of goes along with equipment pre-selection. There's some projects where we have to, the engineer has to be able to know what equipment they're going to select before they complete the design. So in those instances where we have, major equipment like an MBR plant or maybe an SBR IFAS system, those are proprietary company or proprietary technologies that we have to do a pre-selection process where, they have to do usually involves sending an RFP, and it's a quality and cost-based selection. So it's kind of a best value situation. And so just get with us if you need to do that kind of a procurement. And as far as pre-selection, there are two methods you can use. One is the assignment of contract. That's the way we typically like to see it. That way, we can just basically assign it to the general contractor. So in the RFP documents and in the pre-selection equipment pre-selection documents, you would define that this contract is going to be assigned to the general contract once bid. So the other way of doing it is owner supplied, where the owner purchases it directly. And in those cases, we have to have those contract documents approved. And it's a little more difficult process to go through that. Let's see. Oh, actually, I think Nicholas, you were going to talk about some pre-selection.
Sure. Thanks, Kent. Not really a lot to add to what Kent provided. The only thing is just kind of for DEQ, we do want to make sure that if you're a public entity that you're following procurement requirements found in Idaho code. And so as long as you're following those procurement requirements and justification can be made for splitting the project up this way, typically we don't have an issue with that. Important part is to contact, again, kind of driving this point home, contact your DEQ project manager ahead of time in the regional office to just kind of discuss some of the logistics of how that approval process will work, how the SRF funding will flow. And, sometimes we also get into the discussion of if you're actually purchasing equipment ahead of time, we want to make sure that it's stored, contained in a way that won't be detrimental or degrade the equipment itself. So there's a few details to kind of work out, but in general, as long as you're following Idaho code, we can typically accommodate that. Next slide. So land purchase. So this is something that all the different funding agencies typically kind of come to the table and talk through. For DEQ, obviously it's an eligible expense when it's necessary and reasonable, and it has to be land has to be purchased from a willing seller. So you can't use eminent domain or a legal mechanism like that. So pretty straightforward usually on projects that need land. Most new projects need a place for the project to go, and so that's typically pretty standard. It's sometimes challenging, especially in today's market, finding land that's affordable. So typically that's the biggest challenge that we find in these projects that have to do land purchases is just finding a piece of land that the project can afford, that the city can afford, can be a real challenge. So, Kent, do you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, the only thing I would add is just like it says in bold print there, just consult with us early if there's any need for land purchases. It needs to be, that process needs to be started as early as possible.
Yeah, I'll add from Commerce. This is Dennis from Commerce. So one thing too is because cities have the power of eminent domain, if you're going to purchase property, you need to identify up front if you're willing to use that or not. You can decide to let the property owner know, no, we're not going to use it. If we can't come to negotiations, we won't use our power of eminent domain. Not a requirement, but it does then create a different process that will go through to acquire that property. If they decide that, no, we might use eminent domain, it does require more appraisal review to be conducted, but so just keep that in mind. So you're trying to protect that person who owns a property, and if they're concerned that, well, if we can't get to a price, they're going to come and use eminent domain anyway. That creates issues for the potentially not being a fair process. So we want to know up front if the city plans to use it or not. Most cities won't. Right? It's not worth it. We don't like going down that road. The other thing too is then what is the value of the property and how do you get there? Property values, as we all know, have gone up in Idaho. So we pretty much say you pretty much need to go out and get an appraisal. The days of looking at what it was based on the assessor 3 years ago out in the state that we probably aren't going to get you there. Just keep that in mind. And then it also gets into, and you guys, especially the engineers, when you start surveying these old water lines and sewer lines and find out they're at an existing property, private property, and not in right of way or easement. You know, we do talk about prescriptive easements, and if it's been in there for a number of years, you might have a prescriptive easement in place. So, but you know, we'll have to talk that out.
Dennis, that's an important point. I didn't mention is the easements aspect of it. Those can really delay a project if you don't have all the easements. We require before the bidding of the project to have all of our what we call loan closing instructions. And to get that, we have to have the city's attorney and the city's sign certifications basically saying that all easements have been procured with a right-of-way map and everything. So it's something I have. So
yeah, the next portion of the presentation will be on something that everyone probably has on their mind, which is BABA. That basically just about all funding, except for some funding through DEQ, will probably require BABA at this point. And so it applies to all federal financial assistance programs after May 14th, 2022, unless covered by an adjustment period waiver, which we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Basically, the American Iron and Steel dovetails right into BABA. Dennis will talk a little bit about that in a little bit as well, because BABA applies to community block grants a little bit differently than it does to DEQ and to RD here in the initial aspects. And then basically, we'll go into what BABA is. You know, BABA covers iron and steel manufactured products, which have to have a 55% or greater total cost of all components manufactured in the United States, and construction materials, which was like wood and whatnot. But in reality, I did this presentation at IRWA. It's easier to talk about what is not BABA. And so really, what BABA isn't, this hunk of concrete right here in my hand, not BABA. This piece of pavement in my hand, not BABA. The desk that you're sitting at, or you're sitting behind if you're online, the computer that you're using, none of that's BABA. Everything else is pretty much BABA. So I look at it very simplistic. There's very few things. I like to look at what's the easiest to understand, what's not in BABA. Everything else is pretty much BABA. So that I think is going to really kind of play into kind of looking at these projects. I've been talking to our national office because nationally, one of the things that, you know, has already been implemented, I don't think have project yet that's under construction that has BABA. So we've been talking to our national office, trying to get an idea of like cost increases, changes, what's going on. It's still fairly new across the whole nation. But in general, we've kind of seen between a 1 to 10% increase initially right now. Like 1% increase in cost would be for like your sewer replacements, your pipe replacements. Generally, that's pretty simple. A lot of that material is manufactured here. We've already been doing that under AI, also the valves. So that would be a lower cost potentially to you. The higher cost would be on a full like wastewater treatment plant, starting from scratch. That might be a little bit more costly. If it's a lagoon, maybe a little bit less. So still what the cost increases are going to be, and stay tuned because we're all kind of in this together, learning the details of it and getting familiar with what's going to happen with BABA.
Slide.
Yeah, sure.
Equipment furnishings,
Yeah, that's not covered.
not covered.
Those are the items that are not covered in BABA. So
So
like
SCADA PLCs
those will be part of BABA.
will be more.
That is my understanding at this point. Those will be part of BABA. I'm guessing on some of this, like the membrane plants, a lot of those are all manufactured overseas, as far as I know. Those are kind of probably be covered by some waivers. In a little bit, Nicholas, Dennis, and to myself will be talking about some of the waivers and some of the differences between, the agencies on some of the waivers and the process for the waivers. So we'll definitely be covering that here in a little bit. If we don't answer a question, definitely speak up and let Nicholas, Kent, Dennis, or I know.
Yeah, just something wrote. So yeah, it says equipment and furnishings, but don't mistake that with equipment for like mechanical equipment for the project. So if it's equipment that's going to be installed in the project permanently, like pumps or whatever, membrane equipment, filters, permanently fixed into the project, those all have to comply with BABA.
Exactly.
Wire.
Yep.
Conduit.
Yep.
Exactly.
Wood,
They're not Canadian.
what's that?
It does Canadian stuff?
No.
No.
Nope. Unfortunately, everything has to be here. So it really is a broad swath of what will go into a project. And my suggestion is if you think something's going to be a long lead time item for BABA, or you think you're going to need a waiver and you're just even in the design portion of your project, you're going to probably want to get with the agencies that are involved to start that waiver process. Some of the waiver processes will be slower, some of them will be faster, but the sooner you know you need a waiver, the better that project will be situated to move forward at a reasonable pace. And plus, as everyone knows, getting some of these materials is very, very difficult right now in some cases. So getting ahead of this will be really important in knowing what is hard to get and knowing what might need a waiver. And definitely feel free to get with any of the agencies, the engineers that are involved with the agencies, to start working through that process as early as possible. So talking about the adjustment period waiver for BABA, basically I'll cover RD, and if Ken has anything to jump in there, he can jump in there. And then DEQ and Commerce will cover theirs. So for RD, our adjustment period waiver basically has expired. That was in February 2023. So basically any project from February 2023 on will now have the BABA requirements associated with it, with one exception. If your project is under 250,000, which I don't know that there's going to be many of those, then that is exempt from BABA. So if you have a project that's that low, that'll be a good thing, benefit, but I don't think there'll be too many of those. Also, the previously planned project waiver will be expiring on June 19th. So if you have a project out there right now that doesn't have BABA, and you think you're going to have a cost increase, get with the area specialists, get with Kent, Noel, or myself, if it has RD funding, as soon as possible. Because as of June 19th, if you haven't gotten that waiver in, those additional expenses will kick in BABA for a previously planned project that did not have BABA. So get those in as quickly as possible if you think you're going to have a cost overrun.
Yeah, what Kevin's talking about as far as previously planned is the project would have to be either in the facility plan stage or some kind of public review before May 14th of 2022, when BABA actually took effect. So any projects, if they were in the planning stages and, far enough to determine that, yeah, it was a previously planned project, then we could use that waiver, but only up until June 19th. So that, in other words, those projects, if we obligate funds before June 19th of next year, BABA requirements would not kick in. But anything after that, it'll all be BABA requirements.
Nicholas, do you want to?
Yeah, can maybe go back a little bit, just kind of a couple items on the first slide for BABA. The last bullet point there, I think, is probably worth just pointing out for DEQ that BABA will only apply to what we call equivalency projects for DEQ. And so what that is the projects that are funded directly with EPA grant money for SRF. And so this is important because, as Mariana yesterday talked through how the whole SRF process works, we have a fair amount of SRF funding that is recycled state dollars. And so we take those recycled state dollars, the EPA money, and typically we kind of put those together, and then that's our SRF funding that we have available for the year. It's not quite that simplistic, but the important part here is if you have a project that's being funded through SRF that's only recycled dollars, BABA will not apply. Now, if it has $1 of that EPA part of our SRF available funding, BABA will apply. And so this is kind of important because it's conceivable that maybe some years all our projects will be BABA, but it's conceivable that some years maybe we'll have depending on how much EPA funding we have, how much recycled funding we have, state dollars we have, it's possible that we might have a mix and match of BABA projects and non-BABA projects, which would be an AIS project. So again, we're going to have to figure this out. DEQ, we're going to be figuring this out as we go. There's going to be some winners and some losers, obviously, with BABA. So that's an important thing. The other thing I want to kind of point out here is I find it kind of humorous that you're going to hear different pronunciations of this BABA requirement. RD is going to have kind of, I'll call it the southern drawl to was it BABA, and we're trying to keep things a little bit more Idaho Northwest centric, where we're going to call it BABA. And I've even heard people call it Bebe. So you're gonna, and I'm sure if we wanted to, we could brainstorm some different pronunciations of this acronym. So you're going to be hearing these different pronunciations of this requirement. It's all the same. So don't get confused by it. But I think it just highlights the fact that that BABA is big. It's affecting everyone now, and we're all getting our information from different places, and we're trying to coordinate this, and we're basically building the airplane as we're flying it. And so as Kevin said, there's going to be additional training that comes out on this. If you're not already signed up for EPA's webinars, make sure you're signed up for EPA's webinars. They typically are doing BABA webinars. Make sure you're signed up for DEQ. DEQ social media and blast outs, because we're going to more than likely be doing additional training. So I know RD's probably got some training lined up. We're going to be trying to dive into the details of this, and that we're not going to be diving into the details today. We'll try to answer your questions, but as Ryan said, we're building this thing as we're flying it, which means we're going to learn some lessons and have to recover and adjust collectively across the funding agencies. The one thing that we can commit to, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is on the co-funded projects, DEQ, RD, block grant, we're within the state of Idaho, we're going to be coordinating closely on these projects to make sure that there's not duplicative effort as much as we can help. So anyway, little disclaimer there, but we'll move on to the waiver portion. How's that sound, Kevin?
Sounds good. And I was going to say, sometimes going to your different pronunciations, you'll even see BABA as BABAA as well, depending upon who you're talking to out there. And then if you hear someone on the radio singing BABA Baran, they're really not talking about Bob, but that's the only place you're probably not gonna hear it. So, yes, we'll move right on to. Yes.
Do vendors have forms and certificates that say they're compliant?
Yeah, so for RD, I can speak to RD's standpoint. So in our contract documents packet, there will be forms for the engineer, the manufacturer, the vendors, and basically people will sign off on those, and that's what's needed. So ultimately, when it comes down to it, we definitely have all those documents in there that we need as RD. Nicholas or Dennis, can you speak to that for your?
Yeah, and I'll talk a little more on CDBG. So when HUD started looking at BABA, they must have listened to Brian and what his recommendation. So we already have a waiver for the CDBG program that's in place. And that's why you see the 3 phases of how CDBG will implement BABA. So our 2023 funds, which we got about 6 months ago, the first phase is only iron and steel has to be American produced, American manufactured. So what we did is then we joint fund projects with DEQ Rural Development, which already had, essentially it's AIS. So we jumped on to the 5 projects that had AIS already applicable. So that was our first step into BABA. Now, as we head into 2024, we're going to have to, what the slide doesn't say is that funds will require iron and steel and specifically listed construction materials. So, and I don't have that specifically listed materials or equipment to identify that as model. So our funding years used to not make us, we didn't worry about it. Is it 22 money, 23 money? We kind of, when we fund projects could be either or, but now it's becoming more relevant. And so we'll start looking in our 2024 funds this March and April. What projects make sense for us to be involved with? Are we kicking in things that are already required, which makes sense for us to joint fund, or are we going to add additional requirements to this project? So, and the engineers need to recognize that. Well, this is money that doesn't kick in BABA for RD or DEQ. Well, if you're bringing CDBG to the table, we may be kicking it in. And that's something to think about. CDBG is only 10% of the funding. Do we want to kick BABA into this project? We will try to, on the funding side, we're trying not to do that. We'll try to say, okay, let's look at this project. We know RD's already required, BABA RD is already required, and so it makes sense for us to join it. So in a sense, we're riding on DEQ and RD's coattails as we implement on this. And then come 2025, we're fully implemented. By then, I suspect RD and DEQ, with the exception of maybe those DEQ revolving dollars. And we're in the same boat. We're trying to learn and figure it out as we go. Have all the answers.
And for DEQ, we've got one adjustment period waiver, and that's what we've called the design intent waiver that comes from EPA. And essentially, design had to have been started. Design planning had to have been initiated prior to May 14th, 2022. And so if you had a facility plan, if you had, and the next slide we'll talk a little bit more about this, but if you'd started design prior to that May 14th, 2022, then we'll screen you for this design intent waiver. It does have a sunset clause in September 2024, so we're kind of running out of time, but we are utilizing that design intent waiver currently for current funds. So next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about DEQ design intent waiver. I'm not going to go through all these bullet points. The big one is the first bullet point. If you've got a facility plan or PER that's been submitted to DEQ for review and approval, and that was done so prior to May 14th, and that's the project that you're funding, then you would more than likely qualify just right out of the gates. And how do you qualify? Well, like I said, DEQ at the application phase, we're screening applicants for this design intent waiver. So you don't have to apply for it. You don't have to do anything. It's a general applicability waiver. So it's a design adjustment period waiver. It's out there. And if you qualify for it, we're going to be screening you for that during the loan application phase. You're more than welcome to reach out to us if you have questions, or if you believe yourself you should be eligible for this. We're happy to entertain that as well. So you're always welcome to reach out to us and ask questions about that. Next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the categories of waivers. And so Kevin had kind of alluded to this a little bit. There's really three types of overarching waivers. There's a public interest waiver, there's a non-availability waiver, and there's an unreasonable cost waiver. Those are kind of the three categories. And so the public interest waiver is what those adjustment period waivers that we just talked about, that's what those are nested under. But it's just anytime, it'd be inconsistent with the best interest of the public. It's pretty broad, pretty vague. Who determines that? We'll leave that one. Non-availability waiver is probably the one that we're going to touch the most and deal with the most. And that's just when these projects are not constructed, produced in the United States in efficient quality or quantity for the project. Typically, this is project and or product specific. And this is what we're anticipating, BABA is going to really probably kick in some of these non-availability waivers once we get into construction. The next one is the unreasonable cost waiver. That's if the overall project cost, including engineering and administration costs, increase the project by more than 25%. As Kevin kind of alluded to, I mean, we're not sure if this will get triggered, and if you're seeing preliminary engineering cost estimates coming back or bid results coming back that are just off the charts because of BABA, we can look at this. It's written into the code, so we can look at pursuing a waiver. We don't anticipate it's going to be a lot because I think manufacturers are really getting behind this, and will be making a lot of this happen. But it's possible this could happen. So, Kevin, Kent, or Dennis, anything to add to those?
Yeah, the only thing I have to add, Nicholas, is on the unreasonable cost waiver, the way we look at it is if an engineer thinks that might be triggered by a project, we would recommend having it bid side by side, like two bid schedules, one non-BABA or BABA, and the other BABA requirements. So that way you could quantify it in the bids for sure. It'd be a hard number. And then even if it is above 25%, the way our requirements are worded is that you could only decrease or eliminate some of the, if it's ideally it'd be a unit price bid where you would have certain items you could take off the list to say, this is, if we reduce these certain bid items to make them non-BABA, then we would get it down to that 25% level, but not lower. So that's kind of how that works for us.
Just from Commerce and EBG, I don't see there's not a strong appetite to do waivers from HUD. So they're telling us we've already given you those waivers on the way we're phasing this in. So it would be a very difficult process for us to go through this.
Dennis, I have a question from online. Is BABA only required if it's for construction? They assume.
No. So a lot of times people will structure us and put our money in the engineering and use RD or DEQ for construction. Now with that structure, and that would not kick in Davis-Bacon for us. But so if you're using CDBG just for engineering, it will kick in BABA. May not kick in Davis-Bacon, but it will kick in BABA. So we're in the project, they're kicking in BABA.
All right, so I'll jump in here. A couple of public interest waivers that are on the books for DEQ, and I believe Kent or Kevin, I believe these are also on the books for RD as well. And that's the small projects. I think Kevin already alluded to this. Less than $250,000, you're basically off the hook for BABA. Another one is the de minimis waiver, and so this is similar if you're familiar with AIS, that you can essentially put items that are considered incidental to the project on this de minimis waiver. You don't have to apply for it. It just is. And so very similar to AIS. The only difference is that the total project cost, 5%, up to 5% of the total project cost. With AIS, it's, of course, a little bit different, right? Because we like to confuse things. With AIS, it's 5% of the total project materials. So a slight difference there. You get a little bit, what it basically does is you get a little bit more room to work that de minimis list based on the total project cost. So I think EPA's thought is that that's going to help folks a little bit. In the past with AIS, if you're familiar, that de minimis waiver can really help. And we saw EPA very open to leveraging that de minimis waiver when we ran into kind of between a rock and a hard place for finding certain products. So again, as long as that threshold of 5% of the total project cost isn't exceeded. Another one on DEQ books is the minor components for iron and steel products. Again, it allows up to 5% of the total material cost. And so again, this is the same kind of waiver that went through AIS. This is intended that if your project needs to go buy some nuts and bolts from the local hardware store, that you don't have to go through. They just go buy them from Home Depot or wherever. You don't have to go through a product waiver to get those de minimis, those small minor iron and steel products. So those are the public interest waivers we have on the books. Kent or Ryan, do you have anything to add to that with RD?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is for the minor components waiver, you're right, it's exactly the same, pretty much worded the same as the AIS version of that, because it only affects the iron and steel products. A good example would be a fire hydrant that, say, has some kind of pin mechanism or springs or minor parts or that they can't get from the United States for whatever reason, that we could consider as minor components to the overall product. So
Perfect.
I'll have to have on that.
And I would add for Commerce CDBG program, we also public interest waiver programs are applicable to CDBG. So, there might be some of these downtown projects we're looking at work in some of this de minimis requirement. So looking at that.
Okay.
And the other thing I would add, just kind of a shameless plug, is we can fund fire engines, and Bob is not applicable to fire engines, so.
That's good.
Fire engine.
Right. Yeah.
So we'll go to the next slide.
Perfect. So DEQ, again, here we go. Back to the customer handbook. How do we apply for a project-specific waiver? Go to the customer handbook. And here we are. We've got an attachment here for AIS or a BABA waiver. And so if you've got essentially, it covers all project waivers for either AIS or BABA. Because AIS and BABA are so similar, one of the advantages from DEQ standpoint is we were able to kind of blend these two together. And so if you're going to apply for AIS waiver or a BABA waiver, this is the spot you come to. Work with your regional office, your project manager to fill this out. There's a fair amount of information, but it just depends on what you're applying for. It should be rather intuitive, but again, what supporting documentation you need to include and develop, that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, and we're happy to help you. If this is the first time applying for an AIS waiver, or obviously it'll be your first time for BABA, we'll need to work through this form. The owner will need to sign it. So that's the project owner will need to sign it, date it, and send it to DEQ. We anticipate that might be through your consulting engineer. They're typically pretty involved in that process. So that's how we would go through. That's how we're anticipating going through the waiver process. And I believe you guys have a pretty similar process. Is that right, Kent?
Yes, we do. We have a form that's very similar to that. And, when we get to that point on a project, if you have any requests for waivers, just let us know and we can help get that form filled out properly.
Perfect. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is the fun one. All right. So when we've got co-funded projects, who's on first for these BABA waivers? in a perfect world, maybe it might not be that we have very many of these co-funded projects that require BABA. Again, DEQ is going to have some projects that don't have BABA. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops. But one of the things that is interesting is the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. They've come up with two different sets of guidance. They came out with an earlier set of guidance, and then now a later set of guidance. And in the guidance, when it came to co-funded projects, they identified this concept of a cognizant agency. That is essentially the agency, the funding agency, who's going to be responsible or on first base for driving and guiding the BABA waiver process. And in the first guidance document, it said the cognizant agency shall be responsible. In the second guidance, they changed that to may take responsibility. So that kind of leaves us a little bit in a gray area. This cognizant agency guidance is basically helpful, but not helpful in the sense that at the end of the day, it sounds like RD is still responsible for their waiver. It sounds like EPA is still responsible for their waiver. It sounds like HUD is still responsible for their waivers. And so on the local level, we're really trying to move. We really want to try to coordinate this waiver process to make sure we're not duplicating effort. But we're also really pushing, really hoping, and maybe that's too strong of a word, but we're really hoping that there's going to be some coordination on the federal level for these co-funded projects to make sure that we're not cross-threading projects based on these waivers. So again, that's kind of our commitment on a local level. Kent and Ryan and I, we're going to be talking, we're going to be coordinating through these BABA projects, if we have any that are co-funded. And we're hoping that some additional guidance will come out that will allow joint waivers to be issued for single projects for these projects that need BABA waivers. So it's kind of a little bit of a wait and see, honestly. And we're really hopeful that there'll be a process, memorandum of understanding or something that can be put in place for co-funded projects, for a cognizant agency, and to be able to jointly issue BABA waivers when the time comes. So I don't want to go too deep into this. It's just going to take us down a rabbit hole and probably cause more confusion, but there's more work that needs to be done. It's been identified, and we're holding our breath. We're on the edge of our seats, and I know you all are as well. So Kent, Ryan, anything to add to that rabbit hole?
The only thing I would add is maybe our agencies are like Abbott and Costello in this regard. They can't get on the same page. We've been told by our national office that we can't, like you said, RD has to make their own determination on these waivers. And we can use information that was gathered, like say if DEQ had more money in a project, we can work with the contractor and try to get that information to get the waiver done on our side. But unfortunately, there's no concept yet developed where, well, this is the concept, but nobody's agreed on it. So unfortunately, so we just still have to get our own waivers. That's the bottom line.
Yep.
Next slide.
Perfect. So I'm gonna try to run through this really quick. I know we're running a little bit behind time. We're trying to get through the BABA stuff here, and then maybe we can take a break after we all get through our BABA stuff. So implementation. Look at our customer handbook. We've got funding agreement, spec inserts, certification letters, and inspection requirements for BABA, and it's all spelled out in our customer handbook. It's all spelled out in the specification insert. So if you follow those steps, if you follow that spec insert, you're gathering those certification letters, you're doing your inspections, it's all going to work seamlessly and there'll be no issues. Right? Okay, maybe not. But that's the gist of it, which moves us on to RD, I believe, is your kind of implementation.
Right. And just to reiterate, we have manufacture sample, or I guess template documents in our contract document attachments for the manufacturer's certificate. There's one for the engineer that they sign, that they certify the project meets BABA to the best of their knowledge, whatever. And one for the contractor to sign at the end of the project. And basically state that everything they've installed either meets BABA or complies with some waiver. So next page. And that, again, the waivers are pretty simple. The manufacturer is just going to basically say, you have a project description or product description along with the project name. And basically state that it meets BABA. And they sign, one of their authorized company representatives signs it. Sign. So yeah, as far as American Iron and Steel, BABA doesn't really affect AIS. AIS is kind of wrapped up into BABA, so all of the AIS requirements are in that law. And any project that doesn't have to comply with BABA, say we have one that meets one of our waivers, we get one in, it still would have to comply with AIS. So AIS still rules. So. Okay, we'll move on from BABA. Okay, so we'll try to speed things up here a little bit. I'm kind of a little bogged down on a few things here. So as far as the contracting document process and bidding for rural development, we require this specific things, and we always outline that in our letters. Bid tabulation from the engineer, proposal from the low bidder, along with their bid bond. Such, then the engineer's recommendation for award and the owner's recommendation for award. It could be city council meeting minutes, things like that. To approve it. And we also require proof of advertisements affidavit for that. So I think that matches DEQ's requirements pretty much. Correct me if I'm wrong. Nicholas?
Pretty close. Yep.
Okay. So as far as getting from bid opening to notice to proceed, these are the, I'll go through all of these, but our project manual is kind of like, it's an electronic version of the contract documents. We like to have everything in one place if possible. The specs, all of the bidding documents, you know, the award information, performance and payment bonds have to be in there with their powers of attorney. All of the, you know, the insurance, proof of insurance from the contractor, and the executed certificate of owner's attorney. Basically, you know, technical specs, we like to have those in there too, and supplementary conditions, of course. If the project or if the document becomes so huge, we can maybe accept that separate, but typically they're not that big. The plans, we used to try to get the plans included in one project manual, but it ends up being just a monstrous file. So we just usually kept those separate.
All right. So I'll jump in here with kind of DEQ spin on that. So essentially at this point, you've got your DEQ approval of plans and specs, and you go to the bid opening, you open up bids, and as all projects do, they come in under the engineer's estimate. And so everybody's high-fiving, and inevitably somebody asks, what's next? Where do we go from here? And so what I kind of want to emphasize on this one is when you get your DEQ approval letter, so if you rewind back to those plans and specs, when you get your DEQ approval letter for the project, you're going to get those next steps in the approval letter. And so that's going to be the state revolving fund conditions. It's on the second page. And again, we know everybody reads the second page of DEQ approval letters. And so you'll have these memorized. Or if you're like me and I guess everybody else, it's probably going to go into the recycle bin and you'll forget that you even had an approval letter. So what I would recommend is to not do that and to print this letter off and stick it inside the inside cover of the plans and specs bidding document so that when you go to open bids, you can pull this letter out and say, here's the items that we need to do next. Many of these items are similar to what Kent just went over, so I'm not going to repeat them. There's a few additional forms that need to be filled out by all bidders that will be submitted as part of the bid results package. But the next step is you need to put this bid results package together for DEQ because that's going to be submitted to those regional engineers. They're going to review that, and that's going to be the next step. So we'll go to the next slide. So once you've opened bids, you've assembled all those items. You're going to submit that bids results package to DEQ to get the authorization to award the construction contract. And so once you receive that authorization to award the construction contract letter from your DEQ project manager, you can award that construction contract using SRF funding, and you can issue the notice to proceed. So that's essentially at that point, it's green light for construction from DEQ, and we're hitting the gas, we're going. So next slide, one thing I do want to highlight is on that DEQ authorization to award letter, you're not quite done yet. There are some additional items that you need to think about, that you need to plan for, and that's going to be again outlined in those SRF conditions in that construction in that authorization to award letter, and it's going to kind of walk you through each one of those steps. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through all those, but kind of some highlights is we need to have Davis-Bacon incorporated in the construction contract. Another highlight is the successful bidder. So the contractor is going to need to fill out a number of forms, attachments. Again, this is the paperwork that comes with kind of the federal funding. And then the other highlight kind of is we're just kind of setting you up for coordination with DEQ. So we need to coordinate pre-construction meetings. We need to understand how change orders are going to happen. And just kind of, again, you're communicating with your project engineer, so this should be all standardized, but this letter, something that you can pull out and you can use as a checklist, check those items off down the list, and then you know you're good to go. You're always welcome to call us at any point during this process. Reach out to your project manager and say, hey, what do I need to do next? Chances are they're going to say, well, hey, I sent you a letter. Let's walk through this letter together and use it as a checklist. So that's kind of for getting from bid opening to notice to proceed. I think, Dennis, you're next to talk through that process.
Yeah, for Commerce, a few things just to recognize. For the most part, everything DEQ and Rural Development is requiring is what we're going to require. There are a few things you want to that may be a little different. Yes, we want to publish bid notices and make sure it's publicly bidded. The 10-day wage rate update, that requires that before the bids are due, 10 days before they're due, you look at the Davis-Bacon wage rate to see if it was updated. So those wage rates get updated periodically. So that would be pulled into the bidding document 10 days before the bid due date. So that's one of the things that can catch you off guard. I've already got the wage decision in there, and recognize you're going to have to check to see if it's been updated. Mentioned bid tab, contractor eligibility form. We have a specific form. Yeah, you can go out onto the SAM website and find it, the information if the contractor's been to board. But we do have a specific form. There's a reason we have that specific form. It helps us fill out some other annual reports we need to do. And then after construction, for the most part, we've kind of covered those pre-construction meeting minutes, and the other elements have been covered there as far as notice to award, construction contracts. And I do want to mention one thing too. For our CDBG program, we do have our own supplemental general conditions. So if you're looking at, multiple funding agencies on this project, RD has theirs, DEQ has ours, and we have ours as well. And ours have different language, different, so we can't just say, well, RD's is in there, DEQ's, that's good. No, ours specifically has to be in there. So now you don't have to put the wage decision in there twice, because if DEQ is requiring it and we're requiring it, should be the same one. So you don't have to put that in.
Idaho.
Sorry.
Law that we're getting a form that says is having a company certified that they
the anti-boycott against Israel Act and the company owned or operated by the government of China are prohibited. You guys have your own forms for those?
I have been contacted by an engineer or two saying, hey, we have to add this clause into the supplementary conditions or, yeah, or even into the instructions of bidders. And at first I was like, what is all this about? So I checked, there actually is a law to that regard. And so, yeah, it's okay to add that to the contract documents, those requirements. We don't have a form or anything that, put in the documents for that. But those can be put in there. I don't know if they actually have to necessarily be in there. It's a state law, so and follow state law anyway. But it's good, maybe a good reminder. So, yeah. Any other questions on contract documents? The only thing I was going to add is for when we do our award letter, we explicitly list everything that has to be in the contract documents as far as the project manual. So just follow that and you'll be good. I'm going to talk briefly about not everybody's favorite subject, liquidated damages. It is a requirement of our contract documents. To put in a number, a reasonable amount. The contractor goes beyond the completion date through no outside influences like bad weather or whatever. In other words, no excuse for them to finish the project late. There are liquidated damages, and the purpose of those is really to cover the owner's costs associated with not finishing the contract on time. So, for example, they could have additional engineering fees, RPR charges to oversee the contract during construction over that extended period. So, our stance has always been we want those liquidated damages to be enforced, although cities sometimes are reluctant to do that. At least that's what we've seen. But it is a real cost. And you get an amendment from the engineer, they can have additional RPR time, construction management time. That's really what LDs are for. So keep that in mind as a project is moving forward. The contractor is not proceeding with the work in a reasonable manner to keep on schedule. The engineer will handle this typically, that they'll basically let the contractor know you can buy and schedule. LDs are in place. I mean, they're a factor that you have to consider.
Do you have a form or something that assists us calculating those?
I don't know of a form that we have. Joel, do you know of any? I mean,
There's not a form, it's the contractor goes beyond the construction completion date, then the contract actually allows you just to deduct those on a pay application. And so there is a section of the pay application, you can show those coming back out.
yeah, I
They're
think
separate.
right.
But you gotta calculate an amount to put in a contract, $5 a day,
Right. What he's talking about is like a form where you.
percent of the contract.
It could be, I mean, that's really, each project's on their own, so, I mean, if you're only gonna have RPR costs, and you could estimate what that's gonna be.
Yeah, it's basically an estimate, really.
Could be, like, if they're renting space, that, they're building new space, you might add those rental costs in, so it really is project specific.
Exactly. And it's the thing where when we look at the contract documents, Kevin and I are reviewing it, we look to see that number seems reasonable. A lot of times we'll see $500 a day for maybe a smaller project, or maybe 1,000, or maybe up to 2,000. But anything beyond that, we start to question, like, is that reasonable? You're not being punitive, just, to get the contractor's attention. Those numbers kind of have to be supportable. I mean, because if the contractor challenges them, there could be a lawsuit involved, whatever. So anyway, yeah. Go to the next slide then. Construction lead forms, I think Kevin was in early days.
So the next part of the project, when you're getting into construction, is just before construction is the pre-construction meeting. And we as RD have a pre-construction form that guides you through the pre-construction meeting and the items that we'd like, that meeting to address. A lot of those go into like BABA and making sure that that's addressed and people in the contractor are aware of situations. The area specialist will likely be at that pre-construction meeting. They'll supply you with that pre-construction form. DEQ has their suggested checklist of items, not a checklist, but a guide of suggested items. And I don't know if Nicholas, you want to speak to that at all?
Sure, absolutely. So you can find this in our customer handbook. Once again, feel like I need candy. I need to throw out virtual candy for people to answer the question. Where can you find this? DEQ's customer handbook. A lot of these things are pretty straightforward to the construction and engineering industry, and so we don't have a checklist. We just have an outline. And if you're not, grab the outline. Make sure you're covering these items in your agenda. And typically, our DEQ project manager will be on site, and he'll have a copy of this. And if you miss something, he might raise his hand and say, "Hey, you might want to talk about BABA. This is a BABA project," something like that.
Now getting into, you've done your pre-construction meeting, now you're full blown into construction. We're looking at construction inspections, monthly meetings, pay applications, and change orders. And so with regard to RD, the construction meetings and monthly meetings are generally attended by our area specialists. They'll pretty much attend almost every monthly meeting, be out there. They'll be the boots on the ground. If there's something that comes up that needs our attention, they'll alert Kent or I to that, and we'll sometimes come out and look at those projects. Kent and I will try to get out to some of those projects probably about at least once throughout the construction time frame, and then also at the tail end, because Kent and I have to cover basically from North Idaho all the way to Eastern Idaho. It's hard to get to every single site every single month, and that's why we have the area specialists who are getting out to those monthly meetings every single month as they can. Pay applications and change orders will generally go to our area specialists. Those will be in digital form. You'll email those to them. Sometimes they'll have questions on those, and they'll send those to Kent and I for review. If there's something complicated about it, or if it's a really large pay application and that's in like the millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, Kent or I will typically look at those. Beyond that, that's pretty much where we're at with the monthly meetings, change orders, and inspections. So Dennis or Nicholas, do you have anything to add to that? I know we have 2 slides that basically cover those items.
We just say on pay applications, you got multiple funding agencies. If somebody's breaking out who's paying for what, might be EDBG's first up, and we're going to pay up to $440,000 the project, and then it goes DEQ. That may not be the case. It may be broken out. Well, we're just paying engineering. DEQ's paying the first phase of construction, or the latter phase. So just make sure you're documenting and tracking that. Also for CDBG, it can get a little tricky. Sometimes if you have a subrecipient, so you're working in water district, sewer district, that pay app needs to go to the county, then the county submits it to us. So there's another layer of process involved. It can cause delays. And I think we're getting there. I think so. We're pay apps are moving faster. We're implementing our new fiscal system at the state, and I think we're working out some of the kinks with LUMA, but just I think we're there.
Nicholas, anything else to add?
Yeah, a couple quick items on the construction progress meetings and inspections. Make sure that you're CCing your DEQ project manager on any meeting notes or meeting minutes from that. They might not always be able to make it to everyone. That's kind of the goal of our project managers, is to stay involved. And so a couple of, tools to do that. Again, CC them on meeting minutes from those progress meetings. And then another thing that we've observed in the last couple of years is a lot of these progress meetings have gone virtual. And so there's a virtual option for folks to join those progress meetings. And sometimes that can be beneficial, especially if the project's in, the far reaches of a region. Sometimes our regional engineers will just be able to jump on a call and stay up to date, because that's really what we're trying to do here. Is we want to be able, our project engineers in the regions want to stay up to date on these projects, so that then when there are issues or questions or discussions, they don't have to go back and get the whole story and all the whole context, but they're real time, up to date on how the project is going. So it's really to your advantage to make sure that our project engineers are attending those meetings or involved with them, so that they're up to date. The last thing I'll say on this slide is in regards to Davis-Bacon, that can get a little bit tricky. So a lot of times those questions will need to be elevated. I'm happy to help. I'm kind of the point of contact for Davis-Bacon in the state right now. And so if you do have questions, you're welcome to reach out to your regional engineer or reach out to both of us. And if you have any wage rate classification conformances, we'll submit those on your behalf. They'll go through us instead of going directly to Department of Labor. So again, this is all outlined in our handbook, but just a few things to highlight on this page.
I do want to bring one thing up, Jeff. So Nicholas brought up Davis-Bacon. So sometimes you can run into after the fact, it's like, well, they don't have that classification in this wage decision. We're putting in water line, there's no backhoe operator. So where our program requires possibly doing an additional classification, which, if you got DEQ involved and they're kicking in Davis-Bacon, make sure you're working with both agencies so we understand what DEQ is doing and what we're doing. But that can pop up after the fact, it's these additional classifications when the contractor comes to you and says, well, there's no backhoe operator. And that could be the case. These wage decisions aren't ironclad. That's all.
Perfect. And as with, I think Bill had mentioned this yesterday, if you do have those dual funded projects that have maybe all 3 or 4 agencies involved, definitely get with all the agencies, find out kind of how they want the change orders submitted, who needs to sign them, who needs to approve them across the board, because each agency definitely needs to review those. But before you execute that change order and start, making that happen or pay that contractor, make sure you get involved, especially if it's multi-agencies, to find out what each agency is looking for upfront. And even if you're just in the facility plan stage, feel free to contact us and ask, hey, we're looking at getting 3 or 4 agencies involved with this one. What are you guys going to want to see for the change orders, the pay apps, whatnot? Get that information up front, and that'll help you out, move that project forward a lot quicker. One thing again, with regard to RD, if you do have multiple funding agencies, as Noel had said yesterday, you'll want to make sure that the area specialists for that project are seeing all the costs, because they track all those costs. Dennis or Nicholas or Kent, you guys have anything else before we move on to the final couple slides?
I got a question for
Yes.
online. When multiple funding agencies are involved in a project, how do we determine which job site interview form to use? Form SF1444 or the HUD 4230 form to request additional classifications?
That one I'll let Nicholas and Dennis answer, because RD, we do not have Davis-Bacon in our project. So
That's a good question. I would, of course, I would lean on our form, but I think the forms are I'm hoping they're pretty almost similar, very similar, if not identical. And that's where we'd have to have that, I think, have that discussion to understand what is the classification and what agency is going to submit it to get that wage rate. You don't want both of us submitting it at the same time. We'll pick one, either DEQ with Commerce or DEQ can do it from their side.
Yep, that makes great sense. And in reality, all the projects that I've been involved in and seen, block grant typically is funding the engineering and DEQ is funding construction. And so in practice, most of the time that's going to be use the DEQ Davis-Bacon forms. But it's a great question to ask, and I think it's again one of those devils in the detail type questions that it's good to figure out early and up front.
So to lead us to the finish, I think, Nicholas, you have the final couple slides.
All right, perfect. So kind of on the reimbursement request topic, a little bit more detail with DEQ. We'll ask the audience a question. Where are we going to find the DEQ reimbursement request form for your project?
Customer handbook.
Yay, throw somebody a chunk of concrete or something for a reward. So the takeaway is these reimbursement request forms, they are customizable. They're supposed to be customizable. It's an Excel spreadsheet that you open up, and it's really the intent of this is to customize it to each project. Each project is going to have a little bit different contracting mechanism, and the intent of that is to fit that to the overall project. And so the best way to do that is to contact your regional DEQ project manager and work with them to customize this reimbursement request to fit your form. You can change it through the process. It's not set in stone. Like, you don't have to like set it up perfectly. You can put placeholders in this as the project develops, as it evolves. You're going to want to be looking at how much funding you have. We can't allocate more funding on this reimbursement request form than your funding agreement, but it's really intended to be a flexible, dynamic reimbursement request form that fits each specific project. So use it that way, and you'll make everybody's life a lot easier. And again, these reimbursement requests are the intent is submit them monthly. So you're going to fill out this form every month and submit those reimbursement request forms. It's meant to mirror or image the billing cycles of consultants and contractors, those monthly pay apps. It's meant to mimic that. So don't send us reimbursement requests for every single invoice. Package those together. Use this as a cover sheet to get reimbursed each month. Occasionally, we see people that want to do this every 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's best if you do it monthly, especially on a large project. It's going to be, if you wait to do this at the end of the project, it's going to take months to get reimbursement, maybe even longer. So, taking little bites off every month on these is really how the system is set up. The process is set up. There is some flexibility. Let us know how we can make it work for you, but that's the intent of these reimbursement request forms. So, all right, last slide. We're only 45 minutes over schedule here. Green Project Reserve. So this is something that is a requirement of most SRF loans at the end of the project, along with the record drawings, the O&M manual. You're going to have to submit a final GPR tech memo. So recently, we've kind of overhauled the Green Project Reserve process on how to develop that tech memo. We've made it hopefully super user-friendly. Rosemary Regner in our office has just been rocking it. And so if you go to the listening, anybody? Customer handbook. All right. There is a resource to click on a template, and that template is hopefully going to walk you through step by step at the end of the project. It's kind of a cut and paste, plug and play to make it customizable to your project. That replaces the old GPR system where we were making you submit initial, a preliminary, and a final tech memo, and it was kind of integrated through the whole process. And you kind of had to creatively develop that through the process. It was on you. This way you have a template. Again, plug and play is kind of the idea, to streamline it and make it just super simple, slam dunk at the end of the project. So that, I believe, kind of gets us through kind of the end of the engineering requirements for co-funded projects. And I guess we're going to open it up to questions at this point that we haven't already answered.
I have one online. With alternative deliveries, CMCG, PDB, etc., what determines the timeline for the 10-day wage rate update?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And when we open up the alternative delivery box, it kind of blows up the existing process. And so we have to put it back together in pieces. And so with the progressive design build, what we determined was that was within 10 days of the guaranteed max price. And so if you're familiar with that process, that's when we would require that to be incorporated into the final contract, because that's when you actually have the construction contract amount. On the GMGC or the CMAR, again, it would be at final design when that GM essentially subs out or does his own work, bids out that work. That's when we would incorporate that into the construction contract. Essentially, that construction contract would be amended with that GMGC, and it would incorporate those Davis-Bacon wages. So again, it's going to be a little bit different. The timing of some of all those are going to have to be kind of looked at a little bit closer. Of when is that construction contractual mechanism executed, and then we would back up 10 days.
Nicholas?
Any other questions from the audience before we roll?
So, do you have requirements for when we can release retainage?
Yes, that's basically towards the end of the project. So basically, I think DEQ is very, very similar. RD's similar. Basically, we wait till, well, it depends. If you're doing just a grant for the planning grant, we as RD will wait till the facility plan and the environmental are complete, and then we'll pay out everything at that point, but not before then. If it's on the project, we do have a retainage that will wait towards the end of the project when everything's finalized.
That's yours, but if the owner's holding retainage on the contractor.
Yeah, construction, it's defined in the
Contract documents, I believe it's after substantial completion or maybe final. I can't remember offhand. Do you remember offhand, Noel?
Usually you don't pay the final final to the very end, final complete pay application, unless that drags on for a while, then contractors can make a request for partial retainage release. So, but you know, if it's moving on like a normal project, you know, we'll pay 95% at substantial, and then the rest at final completion.
Our online question is DEQ no longer requiring 50% and 90% P&S reviews prior to submittal of final stamped P&S?
So I'll answer that in two ways. So there is nothing in DEQ rules or our guidance that requires like a draft plans and specs submittal. Now, that being said, if you're working with your regional engineer and for whatever reason you all determine that a draft set of plans and specs would be appropriate, then it might be to your advantage. But there is no requirement, and there never has been a requirement on the books to require that. So some regional offices might have asked for that, or maybe even stretched a little bit and required that. But there's no hard requirement for that. On complicated projects, it actually kind of makes sense. The problem is with that is, it's a fair amount of time. It's a workload for DEQ to review plans and specs. And so it might just lengthen out the review process. You might be better off just submitting that final set of plans and specs, getting review comments, getting those turned around quicker. So again, it's going to depend on the project. It's going to depend on the regional office. So the answer to that is no, but maybe.
Perfect. We'll roll right into the environmental.
Thanks, Nicholas. Okay. Environmental work topic I speak on. And I'll start us off, and it'll be similar to yesterday, rotating through the different agencies. Again, if you missed the last one we did in 2020 and want to look at it for more in depth, this is mostly just going to be an update on different things and a few outlines of the general process. So speakers, myself, LaDon Kaler with DEQ, Kent and Kevin with Rural Development, Dennis with CBDG, and Annalie with Army Corps. We'll be going over touch points on what we require for projects. The environmental review was brought about by the National Environmental Policy Act in 1970. Not much has changed. There's been some back and forth, and it does identify the scope of federal and or state environmental concern and direct and indirect impacts. And we look at all of those for the projects that we fund. So Idaho DEQ, we call this the State Environmental Review Process, or SERP, as we refer to it. I am the one in the office that oversees those. So if you are looking to have this done, reach out to me. It applies to all drinking water and clean water state revolving fund projects. A lot of times we address it as part of the facility plan. It identifies the scope of federal and state environmental concerns and objectives that must be addressed to receive the funds. Again, those are for the SRF loan funds, either drinking water or clean water. And it's typically more streamlined and quicker than the federal NEPA process. The timeline for that looks like this. It is sometimes exactly like this and oftentimes not. There's sometimes a lot of back and forth, or systems will change their mind on what they want to do as a project. So we might revisit some things, or maybe they're not ready to address their concerns and not ready to go for an SRF loan. And so they might not do the environmental review as part of the facility plan, and just do the planning effort and then come back to that as part of the loan. But typically around the time the facility plan is technically approved, I will receive notice that it's technically approved and I will reach out to the project engineer. I typically look those over what I call a scoping review, and let you know what kind of things are going to be needed for an environmental determination. So whether it's going to be needed to, for the facility plan or a completely separate document that needs to be put together, what kind of maps, consultations, things like that. And if you want to go into it more in depth, we'll have a scoping meeting. We can have a call and go over it. Sometimes when there is a project with a little bit more involvement, this is a really good idea. And if there are other funding agencies on that, this is when we'll bring in Kent or Kevin with Rural Development, or Dennis with Commerce, or not usually Army Corps because they're a little bit after us in the funding process, but we can bring them in as well. At that time, we'll also talk about public notice, the comment period, and what you believe are going to be the alternatives or preferred alternatives moving forward. And then the environmental review documentation can be created, consultations are made, all that gets pulled together, resubmitted to me. I review the documents, and then we can do a determination and a legal notice. And average time is approximately 2 to 6 months, depending on the complexity of the project. Sometimes it's a lot quicker, and sometimes it's pretty slow, depending on how the system wants to proceed with their public comment period or where they're at in the process. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. So I kind of went into this scoping meeting versus scoping review. A scoping review is what I've started doing just to streamline the process, since we have funded a lot of planning grants lately, and trying to find a time to set up a scoping meeting can often be hard with all the people that are involved. We can do those, but a lot of times, lately anyway, I tend to know most of the project engineers at this point, and they kind of know the process, and so we can have a really quick back and forth about what's going to be needed. But for the scoping meeting to after technical approval, we meet with the project engineer, regional engineer, and possibly the system contact if they want to be involved in that. Go over the project, what will be needed. We use our SERP 02 form, which is found in the customer handbook on our website. Scoping review, sometimes, depending on how much is going on, I will start that when the facility plan is submitted, or if I know that the facility plan has been submitted, I will take an early look at that before technical approval. And then right after technical approval is received, then I will send notes or comments to the project engineer on what will be needed. And that kind of speeds some of the process up when we can. The different DEQ determinations, the different funding agencies, we kind of call these all something a little bit different. So it's kind of good to know whose is what. So we've got the typical categorical exclusion, CADEX, no significant impact. We'll typically figure this out during that scoping review or meeting point. Potential consultations, if any, other relevant data, and most of the time this can all just be added to the existing facility plan, does not need to be a separate document. The next, finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI. The big difference with this, so there's sometimes more consultations involved. Lately, FONSIs have been because of population growth. That is considered excessive, so it does require the extra 30-day comment period. So a draft FONSI is put out, legal notice in the paper of record or greatest distribution for the system, letting them know about the project and provide comments if they have any. Most of the time for those, we just ask for information to be added to the existing facility plan, or an environmental information document created. Record of decision, it's kind of an environmental impact statement. I have not come across this in the last 4.5 years that I've been with DEQ. And we would have to cross that bridge if we came to it. Reaffirmation of previous determination. So if the project takes a long time to get off the ground or something changes in the scope, we can do a reaffirmation of the previous determination. Again, contact me. We'll work through that process. It's pretty painless. And the other is adoption of the other agency's determination. We can often do this with Rural Development and Commerce if they are ahead of us in the funding process is usually when this happens. And we only require a few extra things just because our public comment period is a little different on some things and what we require for public notes and things like that. Again, like they talked about with engineering, the earlier you can rope us all in together, the better for that kind of thing. It's been a pretty smooth process so far. Typical CADEX determination. These are just the things I typically ask for in most of the emails on top of what is already in the facility plan. We have with all of our projects, because we don't necessarily know who is going to be an equivalency project or not, we make sure to cover the Endangered Species Act and essential fish habitat information. So we create a memo for that and provide an official species list. I typically do these around the time of the public meeting because the species lists are only good for 90 days. But I can always reissue those and make new ones however we need to. The proof of the public notice and the comment period, any comments that were received and how they were addressed, meeting notes with the chosen alternative, and some sort of screening table or an overview of the potential impacts on the environment by each of the project alternatives. And this is maybe hard to see probably online because it's very small, but I typically send these out and there's an example in the SERPA 1 form in the customer handbook. But this is just an example of a screening table that was provided at some point for some projects. So the CERT process and new DEQ funding, we've had some questions about this. And as far as we know so far, this is how it is going to look. For the lead service line funding, we have a programmatic CADEX for that one. Emerging contaminants will need a determination, cross that bridge when those projects come to it. The sewer overflow and stormwater reuse grant, we often call OSG. There's no determination, but it could be possible depending on scope of work. So again, disclaimer, this is new funding. This is what we know for now. If it changes, we will let you guys know. The SERP and other funding agencies, federal agencies must meet federal requirements and they will often take the lead. So we often defer to RD on projects. We can make a concurrence with the other agency determinations and review as normally would. Just some FAQs, so some things that I find myself often giving information on. So limited English proficiency, also known as LEP, guidelines refers to we need things to be in another language to reach the whole population, and this kicks in as part of the public notice and comment period. It is to meet Title VI, the Civil Rights Act requirements. It's required to satisfy those LEP requirements. We will discuss it at the scoping meeting or review. I will let you know, and it's based off of census information. And typically it's just putting out that public notice that there is a potential project, that there's going to be a meeting on it, in English and typically Spanish for here in Idaho. Opting out. So if you do not want to do the SERP process, you're just working on your planning grant and you just are putting this facility plan together, but you're not sure what you want to move forward with, you can opt out during the grant process. Typically, you just have to let me and Zoe, who oversees the grants, know, and funding could be reduced if it was initially part of your grant offer, and then the grant can be closed. Next, can the environmental determination be part of the SRF loan? Yes, so if you opted out previously, weren't sure what to do, came back a few years later, and you need a determination in order to use the funds for construction, that can be part of the SRF loan. And the determination will have to be made before funds can be used for construction. So that will be part of the loan agreement and outlined there. If the project scope changes, a new determination can be made. You'll just need to submit the new project descriptions, map, meeting notes telling us that this was the new project moving forward, and then we can make a reaffirmation. And it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Determinations over the last few years, just kind of the breakdown, mostly CADX determinations, a couple of FONSIs, and most of those were because of excessive population growth, so nothing too extensive that needed to be added to that, and not too much added to the timeline, which is really great. We try to move through this process as quickly as possible to help all of those involved. And we have, I think, over 200 planning grants funded right now. So this number will probably be increasing over the next few years on what we put up. Right over to Ken.
So just go through Artie's environmental requirements. First slide basically just shows the level of complexity that increases with each type of environmental determination we make versus CADX without report. Those are for very simple projects like, well, like funding an planning study, CADX without report. There we do have a few CADX without reports, and it's all outlined in our regs. But if you have any questions, of course, contact us. But the CADX, there's just a few. One we've used recently was when you're replacing only pipe and not increasing the size unless it's required to be increased by DEQ regs. And it's in the same right of way, basically replacing in kind. We can do a CADX in that situation, but we still have to contact SHPO, even an endangered species evaluation. But anyway, we'll still move on to the next slide here. So basically, that's what we would have to do. Still contact SHPO and the tribes, get an endangered species list printed out, make sure there are no wetlands involved, which there would be. But it's pretty rare that we do a construction project with a CADX with no report. Most of the vast majority of our projects CADX with report. As long as the project is not disturbing more than 10 acres, actual ground disturbance, we can typically do a CADX with report. So these are the environmental resources that we have to look at in the environmental report itself. And basically, we use the environmental report to make our determination, our environmental determination, which we put on a CADX form. The report helps back up those assertions that we're saying there's no farmland affected or whatever, air quality or noise, things like that. There are no effects to the project or to those resources by the project. Now the EA environment, it's EA short for environmental assessment. Sometimes we get environmental reports that call themselves environmental assessments. It's a little different terminology, but environmental assessment report to us is one that's a little more complex. It analyzes more resources. You see we look at more things, cumulative impacts, aesthetics, things like that are not looked at in the CADX with report. It also has the report itself has a little bit different format. Has a purpose and need. The alternatives analysis is included, where it's not in the CADX report. Basically, it's a little more in-depth report of resources, and it's typical for projects where we have, say, a new well that's not needed for redundancy, basically for population growth, or if you're impacting more than 10 acres. We've had several EAs lately with big lagoons that were put in that were more than 10 acres, and it just triggers that EA report. It's still a little more involved, but it's not. People hear EA. Some engineers get all nervous, and it's like a super complex report, and it doesn't have to be. It can be as complex as as detailed as it needs to be. So just because a factor kicks it into an EA doesn't necessarily mean it should be that much more difficult, but a little longer report. I think I already talked about this. Sorry, geez, go on. Yeah, again, 10 acres is the kind of main trigger point. We can do these to basically on most of all of our projects. So report is typical.
environmental assessments. Again, more than 10 acres, because I got ahead of myself here. Oh, and I should add, sorry, extraordinary circumstances. We do an analysis to make sure that in extraordinary circumstances, that is, there's no effect to, say, wetlands, floodplains. And there are, we sometimes have to do publications on those. If it's affecting a floodplain, we'll have to do, we may, with following slides, we have a few publications. So,
I actually will also go back to the extraordinary circumstances as another example. I had a project a year or two ago where we had an extraordinary circumstance that would have been a CADEX report. It was on a solid waste transfer station. But the county was like, okay, I think our residents are going to be potentially up in arms about this, and we're going to have some people vocalizing some issues. Do you mind if we pump this up to the EA? And I was like, well, that's your decision. You're welcome to do that, because they felt like that would get it out there a lot more. And when you have some concerns where you have some concerns from the public that they might gripe about a project and throw some things out there, if you jump up to an EA, that just publicizes it more, and it ensures that it has some more oomph behind it, to make sure that if there are issues, that they're brought up before you get past that environmental stage and into construction, where you could really have issues in the construction phase. If someone raises their flag, I didn't get proper public notice or notified of this issue, notified of this, or else I would have complained about or had an issue with this particular aspect of the project. So in that case, the EA was justified by the county, and we raised it up to that level. And again, it wasn't that much more work compared to the CADEX, but it gave the county a better feel and a better comfort level moving forward with that project. So now going into some RD environmental updates, and I think this will affect probably many of the agencies potentially here as well, with regard to SHPO. So the SHPO process is going to be changing starting this January. So, well, let's rewind to like 2019. I think, okay, I'll speak to this, that they used to basically take in hard copies and used to email them or shoot them hard copies of things. They would go through, put it into their database, go through that. Starting with COVID, everything was electronic submittal. And so they moved up from there. And then now in that process, in the last 3 years, they were moving to what is a new system called ICRIS. And so this system called ICRIS basically is going to be the submittal system for probably just about all projects for most agencies. And so with ICRIS, what's going to happen and how it affects our process is the consultants or whoever's submitting the environmental or working through the environmental will be basically going to this database, online database. This online database will be filled out with the same exact information that you typically would normally see, that you would normally submit to them by email. And then what becomes different after that is that the agency, there's going to be a primary agency and a secondary agency. So if you have multiple funding sources, for what I understand is that you can fill in the primary agency and secondary agencies. And when you upload that information, it will notify the agency who's been the primary and the secondary to the fact that you've submitted something to SHPO. That agency or those agencies now will then review that information, make sure it's complete, make sure it makes sense for what they understand of the project. And then we can then hit the submit button, and that'll then go directly to SHPO. If we see something that we think we need a little bit more of because we're more accustomed and working with SHPO a lot, we can send it back to you and say, hey, I think we need a couple more pictures. I think we need a few more details here. And then you can resubmit that to us as the primary or secondary agencies. And then that information, once we clear it, will be submitted to SHPO. That will start their 30-day review period at that point. And also part of that, we are also making that determination when we hit that submit button that, will it affect a historical site or will it not affect a historical site? So that is going to be a change that will occur basically starting the first of the year. One thing also I talked to SHPO just, I think, earlier this week to confirm it, is that from January 1st through January 18th, my understanding at this point is they will not be submitting or not receiving any submittals for that period of time as they're in transition to this new system. So if you have a project that needs to get submitted in before then, please get in touch with them. And if it can wait till after the system's been implemented, that's great as well. Any questions on that? And I'll do my best to answer. I'm not SHPO, and I've just been attending a couple of their meetings and talking to them, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer anything in great detail, but that's what I have at this point from them on SHPO. And I was just going to give you a little taste of kind of what the system looks like. I attended a meeting, I think it was last week, in which they demonstrated it. It looks like it was going pretty smoothly. It looked like the same information we typically are asking for. And I think as an agency, I know I was kind of looking forward to it because one of the things that happens when you submit things to the ICRIS system is that you're basically filling out all this information in their database. And this is an example screen of what you saw and or what you'll probably see after January when you're starting to fill these out. But one of the other things that you're going to do is you would typically send us or send them a letter that has the diagrams of the affected potential area that shows kind of where your project site is. One thing that we'll see as an agency is we'll actually now at this point be able to see if there's any potential sites in the area that are historical sites and understand that. Prior to that, we would have to call them up and say, hey, we have this project. Do you have any sites in here? We'll be able to see if there's any information in that area, which will help us make a better determination up front. We could probably get with you a little bit earlier and say, hey, you know, there's a number of sites here. You know, I think SHPO is going to probably require an archaeological investigation prior to that, and hopefully get you guys that information sooner. And so as part of that, one of the other screens that you'll see is this screen here, which you can upload a shapefile. So as the engineers, as you guys are doing your CAD files, you can make that into a shapefile and upload that to here. Or, you know, the agencies can also do that shapefile if you don't have that capability or are not sure how to do that. You can also do the drawing online if it's simplistic and get that into there as well. And then the last thing I wanted to make sure is that one of the other things that they're going to require is 2 photographs for their submittals. And those photographs have to be like in a JPEG or a GIF format. They cannot be in a PDF format. That actually came up as a question last week, which is like, oh, okay. And my understanding of why that is because they use those photos as part of their record, and trying to take the photo out of the PDF is going to be difficult for them. So just submitting that photo directly is going to be important. Yes.
I have a question. Did the SHPO mention if they're going to recognize that that's the Oakley project you're identifying up there? There's 3 funding agencies duplicating. So if their RD is the primary and DEQ is the secondary, and then we're in it too, CVG, and then all of a sudden they're getting a letter from somebody, a grant administrator, like on that Oakley project, they should be able to recognize, hey, we've already responded on this, or we already have the necessary information.
So my understanding is if anyone submits anything after January 1st by email and not through this database, they're going to basically turn around and say, hey, you need to submit through the database. So that'll be a clue to whether it's a consultant or one of the COG members that they will have to go through. And then at that same time frame, they probably can look at that record and see if it's already been submitted. Because for every agency, and this was a really neat aspect, you can see all the projects that are in there. So there's going to be some different levels of access. So if you're an archaeologist, you're going to have like the grand poobah of like resources to look at. Whereas if like we're an agency, we're not going to be able to look at all the intricate details of that report. But one of the cool things is you can go in there, and I think even the public will be able to do this, is look at all the projects that are in there, see what agencies are assigned to them and who has it and who's in it, reviewing it, and where it's at in the review process. So that was kind of a neat aspect that they went over, that I think if the COGs are like, okay, I know I need to submit this, they can look up by city, by agency, who has or who hasn't submitted something. And then I can go into like our queue and be like, okay, we have these in our queue. Where is it at in the process? So that was my understanding. One of the things I definitely want to plug is the training is likely to occur in January 2024. So there's going to be multiple training sessions. There's going to be training sessions for like the general public consultant world and the city world. There's going to be training for the agencies, as I understand it. And there's going to be training for the in-depth users, which are the archaeologists, which are really doing the groundwork for SHPO. So stay tuned, look at their website. My understanding is the training will occur in January. One of the other things that we as RD have and has been pushed down is we still use our environmental resource directory, which is on our website. Again, all of our resources that you guys are needing will be on our website. But one of the things in our environmental resource directory that we had was the notifications of the tribes. Actually, let me step back one more time. So that was the SHPO process. If you're dealing with the THPO, the Tribal Historical Preservation Office, that process will be the same. We as the agency will go out there and we'll contact them. They don't want a lot of consultants and engineers contacting them all over the place. They prefer the agencies individually to contact the Tribal Historical Preservation Office. So that process will remain pretty much the same. Now getting back to the tribal directory, with our resource directory, we had multiple tribes that we'd contact on there. Our national office has asked us across the nation to use TDAT, which is the Tribal Directory Assessment Tool. A lot of other agencies already utilize that, and really doesn't change the process a whole lot more. We contact a few extra tribes that are outside of our state, and that's about it. And up to this point, I don't know that we've ever heard back from the tribes when we send the letters out or the letters go out. Just a few more environmental tidbits that I think are important for part of the environmental process, whether you're doing a CADEX with report or an EA, is to make sure that you define your area of potential effect well, that if you have multiple options and multiple phases, that you address all those on these diagrams that would be submitted to like the SHPOs or the THPOs, or looking at the wetlands or any of that information. Because I had a project up north where they had the potential to look at multiple stream crossings. The engineer's like, hey, I don't know if this stream crossing is going to work. We want to throw a couple more in. I said, let's throw those into the environmental report now, because if we don't throw those into the environmental report now and we approve it and we're down the road and you have to, in construction, move that, alignment a bit and it's not covered in the environmental, we're going to have to stop construction, go back and look at that environmental again and reopen it again and make sure we're covering it. So my suggestion is, if you think you're going to have multiple options, include all those options in the environmental report. And I think that's probably would be similar to all agencies, I'd presume as well. DEQ or community block grants, different options, including in the environmental report. Okay, perfect, I'm hearing yes. Few more tidbits. One of the things that comes up that I oftentimes have to remind myself with RRD funding is this is not the case with cities or public utilities, but if you're like a homeowners association looking for funding, basically we're going to want them to do a phase 1 environmental site assessment, because we look at basically looking at in order to pay back that loan, there's not a guaranteed source. So we look at land saying, hey, if you can't pay back this loan, we may have to take your land, but the agency doesn't want to take back land that has contamination on it, or we want to know about that before we get involved with the project. So in the case of like homeowners associations, we're going to ask for a phase 1 environmental site assessment before moving that project forward as part of the environmental documents. A couple other things I want to go over is just some useful information out there. I'm not going to go into great details, but these things will basically help you with a different CADEX with report or environmental assessment. Again, we have our guides, 1970-B Exhibit C for CADEX with report, which guides you through that. If you don't want to look that up, just talk to Kent or I, or speak to one of the area specialists. And with the environmental assessment, It'll be 1970-C Exhibit B. And those kind of walk you through the process. If you ever have any questions on the contents, I oftentimes will work with the engineers or the environmental specialists who are working on those, and they'll run things past me and say, hey, can you take a quick look at this? Make sure we're on the right track. I have no problem doing that. Ken has no problem doing that as well. So those are my suggestions of additional tidbits. One other thing that came across that you can do a quick environmental screening that I utilize, NEPA Assist, is by the EPA. You can actually go in there, draw out your project diagram, put it on there, take a look at it, and it'll quickly give you a synopsis of, is there any wetlands issues, historical issues, other environmental issues that could potentially creep up that might throw this from a CADEX with report to an EA potentially. You can do that. I do that already when I quickly hear about a project. So that's another resource that you can go out there and take a look at it. I wouldn't rely on it exclusively 100% to do your reports. You definitely want to go out to those directly to the resources themselves, but this is a good screening tool. Now, it's to kind of
For CDBG, there are 4 environmental levels to look at. So get CDBG funding, the application process. You've already started some of the scoping to look at this project and send out some of your letters or scoping letters, what we define as scoping letters. You get funded, what direction you got to do environmental review. The first one is of our 4 levels is what's called exempt and categorical exclusion, not subject to 24 CFR 58.5. What is that? That's if we're just paying for design professional services and admin services, that'll take you to exempt, or purchase of equipment, which I'll plug it again, includes fire engines. So that would be exempt, requires no public notice or public comment period. So yeah, if we're just paying for engineering, let's say you're doing a $5 million improvement on a waste treatment plant, and we're just in engineering, exempt. It's not quick. Categorical exclusion subject to 24 CFR 58.5. This is typically construction of an existing public facility or infrastructure that will be retained as the same use and not increased in size or capacity more by 20%. And there's examples there. Maybe you're relying on a new cell or replacing existing water sewer lines. If this work requires some mitigation measures, maybe you're within that 20%, but you're in a floodplain, or you got to do an a biological assessment or an archaeological survey, then it keeps it as a categorical exclusion, and you would have to do public notice, public comment period. If you don't have to do those mitigation measures or further analysis, the project would convert to what's called convert to exempt. Therefore, no public notice is required. EA, environmental assessment. This is a construction of existing facility or infrastructure that increases size by more than 20% of new construction. Maybe you're doubling the size of your water tank, or you're looking to sell or installing a new well. Now you're entering EA. There's more involved, more steps required, and does require public notice and public comment period to determine after that assessment, is this a finding of no significant impact? So if it's finding no significant impact, we can, we'll look at it at Commerce and concur with that. It could be a finding of significant impact. I haven't run into that I don't think I've ever run into that. So that's environmental assessment. EIS, environmental impact statement. If it was determined by the environmental assessment that it kicks you into this EIS, maybe you're eliminating habitat of an endangered species. We're probably not going to be joining with you in this project if it's kicking it to an EIS level. We'll have to think about it. It's worth it for us to do that. So those are the 4 levels. Additional standards I mentioned yesterday, HUD. This is HUD funding, and it does look at housing more so than infrastructure. And there's additional standards that come with our environmental, and that's where you get into, we're talking a lot of water and sewer here, but we fund a lot of different projects. So does HUD, mostly housing, but that's where they get into noise abatement, explosive and flammable operations. This was pretty big title here, toxic chemicals and radioactive materials. To me, it's contaminated soils. and then airport clear zones and particular accident zones. So that's in our environmental. So that's why we'll just adopt DEQ's environmental on this water project. And we can't do that because we have to look at these other elements, usually on water sewer. You're not going to see any problems with those. And then there's this other requirements checklist, which I think extenuated. There must have been some lawsuits that went further into detail about floodplains and airport runway clear zones. And was kind of laughing to myself yesterday because Brian from HUD helped IRWA get some more money. Hopefully they'll do another expansion. And I'm like, are we in a clear zone here? I don't think we are, but so something to think about when that environmental comes across our desk. We'll look at it, make sure we're not in a clear zone. But that's CDBG environmental.
All right. Hello, everybody. It's morning here, but I'll say good afternoon to those of you and everyone in Boise. Karen and I are with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Walla Walla, and I assist Karen with the environmental review process for USACE for the 595 program. My name's Annalie Coulter, and I'm an environmental resource specialist here. So I'm just going to run through my slides. I just have 3 fairly quickly. A lot of it will be duplicate information. We're a federal agency just like USDA-RD, so we have the federal environmental review requirements established by the National Environmental Policy Act. So it's the federal action of USACE funding rural communities under the 595 program that triggers the environmental review process for us. So anyway, the first slide I have up here is just the level or types of NEPA documents, that we would employ to meet environmental compliance requirements. So just recently, we were the Council on Environmental Quality changed and revised the NEPA regulations to allow federal agencies to adopt another federal agency's categorical exclusion, which is in essence kind of the lowest level of NEPA review that we do. So is a Cat X. So, however, USACE does not have a category under our categorical exclusions for funding under the 595 program. So we've never been able to just issue our own categorical exclusion. We've always had to jump either to accepting the EID or EA prepared by the proponent, which is my next bullet item. But anyway, now we can adopt, like in this case, it would be RD's categorical exclusion. So that will streamline the process. So that's great news. And bullet number 2, I kind of alluded to this already, that we can accept an already prepared EID, EA, or environmental review document that's prepared like by the city or usually it's a contractor for the city. And all we have to do is review that document, check for any environmental gaps or non-compliance issues that we might see. If we do, we just account for those in the required FONSI then that we issue. We write our own FONSI, prepare a draft, and it does go out for public review and a comment period of usually about 15 to 30 days. And then typically on these, because these are beneficial, non-controversial actions, we typically don't get any, protests or comments. So we were able to finalize our NEPA process, with the finding, the district commander signs the final FONSI. I just made a little note there. If there is no EID, EA, or ER prepared and we can't, for some reason, adopt a categorical exclusion, then we do prepare our own, typically EA, with an associated decision document, a draft FONSI, and go through the process again, just send everything out for public review. Number 3, very, very unusual that this would happen in these types of actions, that it would elevate to impacts to the environment beyond significant or, at significant levels. So that would kick us into the environmental impact statement process. But we wouldn't, that's usually not the case. Thanks, Ladon. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just noted here that NEPA is like an umbrella environmental law, and there's several numerous additional applicable environmental laws, regulations, and executive orders that do apply and that we would still need to look at. So the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act are, and the Clean Water Act are typically the biggest three for these type of actions that we have. However, I did want to mention that socioeconomics and environmental justice are at the forefront of being included in our environmental analysis now, as is the greenhouse gas emissions, climate, and climate change. So we're having to make some adjustments to account for those resources as well. So, and typically, the last thing I just wanted to add here is that typically there are other agencies or the services, we call them, the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that we must then initiate some kind of coordination and or consultation with them and to complete the required environmental compliance. And then the next slide, please. Thanks, Ladon. Okay, I just wanted to say that, of course, everyone probably already knows that that NEPA provides an opportunity for the public to be involved in our decision making. So that's why we provide those draft documents to, like I say in that first bullet there, members of the public, tribes, and other federal, state, and local agencies. And our review period is typically 30 days, but sometimes we reduce that to 15 in the name of schedule. So we do consider all comments received, and based on those comments, make a decision about whether or not we would ask that the proposed action, be revised. And then the last bullet there, we just make a decision and then issue the final decision document, typically a FONSI. And like I said, that has to be signed by the Walla Walla District Commander.
All right, I just want to mention here, on CDBG, I kind of touched upon it. If category exclusion that cannot convert, there is a public comment period, 24 days, and an EA is a 30-day comment period. I just want to recognize too that these can also be post. It does require a few more days, but you start getting out in the smaller communities and of the newspapers that are publishing everything now. So we can post it as well.
Yeah, as far as RD, public involvement, we don't require any advertising or public notice for CADXs. The CADX with report. For EAs, we do require a minimum of 14 days of public notice of availability of assessment. It can be up to 30 days if we feel like we need more time. And then one final publication after that, if we don't receive any comments on those. So there's a 0 comment period on the FONSI notice. I would add that we also have an EIS level of environmental review, but we almost never get to that point, and we probably wouldn't fund a project. It'd be too expensive.
And then for DEQ, we require a 14-day comment period prior to the adoption of choosing the alternative. So that's where public notice would be put out. How a comment period systems they have a monthly meeting scheduled like most cities, put it out a month prior to that, or at least 14 days prior to that meeting, where they'll then discuss the project alternatives and what the recommendation is to move forward and accept comments on that. This can be posted in the paper of record, flyers sent with billing, posted at central locations or on social media, whichever way will reach the public most effectively. And if you're not sure, just reach out and I will help you. Some helpful links are here. I'm just gonna move forward. Are there any questions?
Donna, I got a question. I'm curious, because you mentioned social links for notices. Is that a DEQ internal decision or did that come down? Yeah.
I think that was a DEQ internal decision during COVID.
Okay,
People and we system. So if they have like a really good public involvement that way, and it's more than what they get with the newspaper, it's a really good outlet for people to use. So that's kind of where that came into play over the last few years. Okay. Any other questions? This. All right. We'll move right into this. It'll be fairly quick. So just as a note, we're a little bit behind our regular schedule. If you have to leave or jump off online, this is all being recorded and will be posted, and I will be emailing it out to you from there. Final speakers. Go ahead, Noel.
So no, not a whole lot to say here. I think we kind of covered this yesterday as well, but finishing out your project after you get through engineering and the environmental, it's basically, all the design work that you're gonna have, getting your project out to bid, which they covered today. So not a whole lot more to add here, but we will be with you through this whole process and engaged in it. So just keep working with your area specialists on at this phase of the project. That's really all I have. Contacts.
and for CDBG, similar, we've talked about it and got over close out documents. And this is also to help, and part of this is closing out the grant, submission of final progress reports, performance reports, and financial reports. There's certificates of success, but we want, and we have some summarized documentation that have to be submitted. And, we're working with you at this stage to apply those documents.
All right. I think same as yesterday. It looks like Karen's on, but not unmuting. So, okay. Go to the next one. How to apply. If you have questions, reach out to Karen or Cindy Bowen, and then Mariana.
Mariana with DEQ. And for the final closeout, you will work closely with DEQ's regional staff to do site visits. One thing they will do too is they will notify the state office that they're withholding the last 5% of the project and they're getting close to doing the final inspection. And that we will review the documents and make sure we have everything we need on our end as well before we pay out that final disbursement. We will then reach out to the bond attorney, if there is one, give them the documents. We usually share the loan offer and we work out a closing date with the bond attorney. And we also share the amortization schedule at that time once we set what we call a closing date for the loan to go into repayment. Once we set that date, the first repayment that's due to DEQ is 6 months out. We do maintain all the bonds at this point, and so all the repayments, if you have any issues, you contact DEQ Grant and Loan Bureau, and we'll help you out with any of those repayment issues, but we will be invoicing you on a biannually period. And that's about it for me.
Excuse me.
Similar to DEQ, will issue the notice that the construction's done. Your first payment will be due a year from completion. At that time, you'll get the amortization schedule. We bill you annually, and kind of the same deal. We'll release securities with the county, anything that was filed, and you'll get a letter for your records stating when the project's completed that you don't owe us any money. So.
There's just some time for questions. If anybody has any lingering things they would like to go over. Anyone virtually, in person? I did have a question about handouts. So I have printed copies here with the note taking. But if you want like a bigger size version, I did post those online with 2 slides per page, so they're easier to read. And if you want a printed copy, just let me know ahead of time and I can get that to you. Karen's on if you guys, Karen, do you want to go over your last slide?
There wasn't anything real big or anything, so it's pretty self-explanatory, and all my contact information on there is on there. So please feel free to reach out at any point. Cindy and I are both very happy to help. Like I said, Cindy is an expert on all of our other programs, and I'm happy to talk to you at any time about the 595 program.
For those of you that wanted to stick around, we did have a little additional hour built in to go over some project examples. That's totally optional. So if you want to leave, you can. If you want to jump out, you can. Again, it will be recorded, so you will have access to this conversation if you want it. If you're in person and you need a snack or use the bathroom, go for it. I know it can get kind of long, and engineers can be slightly long-winded. So we've got a little over, but good job. You guys kept it to only like 16 minutes over. All right, so I think Nicholas was going to talk about this maybe, or maybe it was Mariana or me. I don't remember. I will defer to Nicholas.
Sure, absolutely. I think we're going to tag team with Kent and Ryan and Dennis and Karen on these project examples. But basically, behind the scenes, as we've talked about, Mariana's talked about, we're coordinating between the funding agencies. We meet quarterly to discuss what projects we've got going on, what we're funding, how we can pool our potentially co-fund projects, pool resources to make the money stretch a little bit farther. That's specific, it was really, I think that really shone, especially when we got all the ARPA funding. DEQ got all the ARPA funding in the last couple of years of how can we stretch these projects to the greatest need and get leverage the most money to these small communities. So that's kind of the goal, is to get as much funding to these Idaho communities that are in the highest need. Anything else to add to that slide from our funding partners? We can go to the next slide then. Hearing nothing. All right, so we wanted to just run over a few examples, and we can go as quick or as slow and answer questions if we want to. But New Meadows is a great example of a project that was a high need small community that we were able to co-fund with our DEQ, RD, and Community Block Grant. And so their community, obviously around about 500 people, a couple hours north of Boise. And they were looking at just their water system was just in major needs of upgrade. They needed a new well, new tank, new booster station. Their distribution system was leaking, and so it was time, right? Like it's, as Mariana alluded to the first day, a lot of these systems have just kind of hit that point in their life where they need the check engine lights have gone on, and there were some major updates that needed to be done, and so they already have about $125 a month rate, and so it was pretty substantial. They already have pretty high rates, and so this was kind of a bit of a leveraging process to try to keep their rates as low as we could. And so you can kind of see on the left there's a bit of a cost breakdown there of the different funding sources. DEQ brought some SRF loan. We also brought a pretty substantial ARPA grant, about $2 million of ARPA. RD was able to bring some loan and grant, and then community block grant brought a full $500,000 to the table. So just kind of an example of multiple funding sources getting kind of stretched out to cover a project for a small community. Construction's almost done, so I think it is basically done. They're just kind of finishing things up, and so it's been a successful project that we've been able to co-fund. Dennis or Kevin, Kent, anything to add to this example?
No. That's great.
Perfect. The only thing I would add, the CDBG was we're just in engineering. Yep. So.
Perfect. Okay. Well, we'll move on to another example. So City of Genesee. So this is like kind of a rock in a hard place type of situation. They got kind of hit on both sides, drinking water and wastewater. So on the drinking water, it's kind of been an ongoing situation that really escalated a couple years ago, where their two primary wells, one of them got tagged with nitrates above the MCL, and so they basically had to shut it down. And their other well was running out of water. So basically not a good situation. Like one well is contaminated and the other well is running out of water, and they didn't really have anything mobilized to deal with that. So I know Rural Water folks remember we mobilized the temporary water trailers for Genesee, and the city did everything they could to reduce usage and try to kind of limp along. So that was obviously not a great situation. The solution that was brought forward was basically drilling 2 new wells in a deeper aquifer, hopefully targeting a deeper aquifer of higher quality. And so RD was kind of the I guess you'd say the lead funding agency on this one, and then we were able to come kind of behind them with an ARPA grant and basically fund both the wells. So right now the first well I think is pretty close to being completed, bringing online. I can't remember the last update if it's online or not, and they're just starting drilling of the second well. So they've kind of survived that initial storm, and it looks like they'll have 2 good wells moving into the long-term future. This one was challenging, especially because City of Genesee is kind of a bedroom community to City of Lewiston, which is 15 miles to the south, and City of Moscow, which is 15 miles to the north. So their median household income is actually pretty high when compared to other rural communities. And so it's a little bit hard. Obviously, you don't see block grant on this list, and it's a little bit more difficult to bring grant funds. But looking at the drinking water, I think their rates were going to be upward near $100+ a month, $125 a month, just for the drinking water. And I'll talk about a little bit more about the wastewater. But Kevin or Kent, do you have anything to add to the Genesee drinking water project?
No, the only thing I would add would be that because, like you say, their income levels were too high to qualify for grant. This would have been perfect for an EQUAG if they did qualify, the Emergency Community Water Assistance Grant. But their income was too high. I would say that the engineer did a pretty good job of keeping that well driller, getting the well driller out there to get that project done. And finally got a really good producing well. So it is online right now. It's all complete.
Yeah. moving back, if you can go back a slide before we get to the pictures, that's the fun part. On the wastewater side, it was I would say even more challenging. So this City of Genesee's kind of been in a tough spot with their existing wastewater lagoon system, and EPA has kind of been breathing down their neck with their NPDES permit for a lot of years. And so they've had some violations and some fines, and they have an existing consent agreement with EPA to basically fix everything. And so it's kind of a tough spot. And as they move this project forward, the initial project estimates back in kind of the mid 2000s or 2015 to 2020 range was about $6 to $7 million for this project. And so DEQ did fund this with a $6 million SRF loan, and then life post 2019, as they moved into bidding and construction, happened, and we saw costs just escalating. And so at the end of the day, the engineers were estimating that the $6 million project went to closer to a $20 million project. So almost 3 times more in cost escalations. And we're seeing, we've all kind of lived through that. We have a little bit of a breather right now with some of the cost escalations, it feels like. But Genesee really got hit hard with this. And so, I mean, if you're looking at a $20 million project for, a community of a couple thousand people, they were looking at $200 plus a month rates. So again, it was really a challenging situation. And so what we were able to do is we were able to bring some of the ARPA grant money. It was really great timing to be able to help Genesee get out of that tough spot. So we were able to give them an additional $3 million in loan. We were able to give them almost $7 million in ARPA grant. And then Army Corps was able to give them $500,000 as well. And so that project was bid this fall, and it came in pretty much a little bit below, but pretty close to where the engineers were estimating. And so right now we've got almost an $18 million loan, and the city right now is only going to be on the hook for debt capacity of about $6 million, which will bring the rates to about a little over $100 a month is what they're anticipating. So again, $100 a month rate, it sounds like a lot, but when you're staring at a $20 million project for a small community, it was pretty amazing what kind of grant funds we were able to leverage and kind of get them out of a jam. So this one's just starting construction, just breaking ground over the last couple of months. And so, we're really hopeful that construction will continue to move forward, and that, in the next couple of years, Genesee will be in a much better spot than they were, a couple of years ago. So a little example of a lot of funding, a lot of even grant funding here going to the city of Genesee. And we have a lot of examples like this just to kind of leverage off of this. A lot of examples where systems were kind of stuck in this 2020, 2022 timeframe, and we were able to, collaborate with RD and try to move some of these projects that were looking at cost overruns, trying to move them a little bit closer to the finish line. Not that we're out of this mess, but we feel like we have a little bit more breathing room on some of these projects. And so a lot of great projects like Genesee that have been able to keep moving forward because of the collaboration that has happened at the funding level. So next slide, we'll look at a few pictures from the drinking water project. So that's their new well house, and we're pretty excited that they're moving forward with that. So those were the only 2 examples that we wanted to bring forward, and I think IDWR had a few project examples they wanted to talk about.
Yeah, and then just as a side note, Annalie from Army Corps did send me an email, and I think the FONSI determination is finalized for the project, the wastewater project. So they're excited about that and moving forward. Justin's going to talk about some Idaho Water Resource projects.
So I'll try and keep ours brief, only because our funding partners are generally federal grants rather than DEQ and community block grant. This one in particular, they just got a $90,000 loan. Construction was set to begin in September. I think they're a little behind the ball, but they were able to partner with the Henry's Fork Foundation, Trout Unlimited, a handful of other nonprofits, and they were able to secure grant funding up to 125% back of the envelope of the total project cost. So ours is just working again like a bridge loan, so they can get NCS funding at the end of it. Falls irrigation, this one is kind of been a big deal to us. We're working with them, and I want to say Idaho Power and their water users have also chipped in to help kind of bring this cost down and reduce what the users are going to have to pay. But they're staring at a $9 million project to replace their pump housing. We've initially spotted them a loan for $9 million, but now we're starting to award grant fundings, trying to knock out some of that total so it's a little less against their water users. The last one I've got is the Beeline Water Association, and this was one we had talked about yesterday. Just really quickly, it's a slow sand filtration for an HOA up north. They were in a bad spot. The check engine light had very definitely come, and we got them some money. Back then, the rates were a little better. They were able to finish out construction and send us some pretty nice pictures. I believe that's the last example I've got.
Any questions or anything you guys want to bring about or talk about or anything? Please tell us. Let's see. Get me out of here. Make sure I don't have anything virtually. All right, I will close it down then. Thank you guys so much for attending, and thanks again to Idaho Rural Water Association for letting us use this building. It's been really, really great. Their training facility is awesome. For those that are virtual and haven't had a chance to see it, it's fantastic. It's been a really great training. I'm really happy to have all of you. I will be sending slide handouts and recordings and all of that, and a survey. We would like to know how we did, how we can do better, and maybe some different topics for next time. And as always, we know we probably need more time, just the way it goes some days. Thanks again and have a great day.